Streaming? 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 So people in chat, is this coming through okay or what's going on? So people in chat, is this coming through okay or what's going on? Yeah. Okay, so right. Sorry for the grew up. I've never streamed onto YouTube before, so a bit of a work in progress. Oh, let me Telegram stream. So again, sorry for people in chat. This probably isn't going to be the most polished, but like I say, I've never streamed onto YouTube before, so this is a bit of work in action. So if you bear with me. Yes, I say to people just coming in onto the Telegram and people just driving it down to YouTube. This is my first time ever streaming onto YouTube independently by myself. So I apologize. This is a bit boomerish. Audio is a bit patchy. Is that across the board or what's the audio like? Is it just on YouTube or is it the same on Telegram? People on Telegram, tell me if the audio there is working okay. People to filter in. There. Nice. So how are you doing, chat? How is chat doing today? Because we're very cantankerous yesterday. Little patchy on YouTube. Picture is good, but audio is fading in and out from. Sounds okay now. I don't know what be the issue with YouTube. Afraid I couldn't comment there. If there's an issue similar on Telegram, then try and fix it. Would you name the zoo, Michael? I really can watch. Can you put your Telegram desk chat in? I mean by that, Kel? Very specific what you're asking there. Oh, yes. And sorry if I'm a bit rambly, just waiting for more people to filter in when and as they wish. Seems fading in and out. YouTube. Mic is good, but clipping turn. Yeah, I don't really have any software to normalize the mic. I've just put in the mic and it seemed to have worked so good so far. So yeah, there shouldn't be any audio from the background video I'm playing. It's just a montage of various footage I put up together for the stream. So you sound fine. I don't know why the rest of chat is having audio problems. Okay. I hope Felix Rex is in the chat. Thank you, Felix. I appreciate it. So audio seems to be okay. The only audio problem is moving away. Okay. Right, I'll try and put this and keep facing towards the microphone. Like I say, I am new to independently hosting streams, so apologize again. Might be a bit boomerish and stuff, but hopefully I'll improve over time. So, yes, so again, just in case you've started, I can't hear anything. This is on Telegram, how to join the... I don't want to be rambling too much about trying to get people in. People are obviously here for... And players. Okay. So I apologize. I probably have very bad streaming etiquette as it goes. But so, how are you doing, chat, on YouTube and in Telegram? I hope you are in a better mood than you were yesterday. You were quite cantankerous yesterday, the Telegram chat especially. I hope you're all doing well. So, again, if people are going to keep asking me to ask about certain ethnicities, I'm afraid I'm probably not going to be able to do that, especially on YouTube, and it's just not kind of the thing I really follow, so apologize on that. Assuming you're waiting for more to join Michael rather than talking to a muted mic, the mic shouldn't be muted. People seem to be hearing it. The audio is clipping in and out. It's getting more stable. Do you have a noise gate enabled? No, I don't. Like I say, I haven't gotten any software or anything installed at the moment. It's zero sound. I can hear on YouTube, but not on Telegram. Larry Go. Hi, I worked out. I forgot to unmute myself in Telegram. Apologies for that. That was my bad. Live and learn, guys. I apologize for that. As I say, this is all a bit of a new learning curve for me. But yes, so provided chat is happy, I guess we will kind of begin. And again, if anyone has any questions to kind of plug the stream along, because I don't usually structurally streams this stuff, I tend to ramble on about various issues as they come up. So I will try to endeavor to look between YouTube chat and the Telegram chat and try and string conversations and expand on things as they come up in the various chats as we go along. So your audio is excellent, great mic. People are hearing on Telegram, good. So I think we can pretty much plow into it. So yes, so just a quick recap for people who might not be following the Telegram obsessively like I do. By and large, I won't say it's settled into stalemate, but the Russians aren't really making any big plays across Ukraine for the past few days. There's been significant fighting in the Donbass, but they haven't made any of the large advances that they had been making up to for the first 2 weeks of the war. There seems to be some small advances in around the Nikolaev area, but mostly the story there seems to be the Russians building up forces to either make a play for the city or just encircle it on the western side of the Bug River. There is continued fighting in the northwest of Kiev and the Bucha and the Irpin area. To the east of Kiev, where the lead Russian advanced columns arrived a few days ago, there doesn't seem to be much there apart from occasional skirmishes and probing. So east of Kiev is quiet, although the Russians are there, and I think they're largely building up their forces. And I don't know why, but we just don't seem to hear a lot of what comes out of Sumy and Chernigov Oblasts anymore. Kharkov, there's small localized advances here and there, but it's mostly the area. The story out of the Kharkov area is just the continued Russian shelling of the city itself and airstrikes on military targets around it. But other than that, it seems the Russians whatever reason, be it logistically, be it because they're trying to hold out for some kind of negotiated settlement, just building up their forces, consolidating their gains, whatever it might be. The Russians don't seem to be engaging in any large scale advances or offensive maneuvers. That the first 2 weeks of the war was really, what's the right word, was marked by. So that's kind of the general situation across the board as I've seen it the past few days. So with that bit of a ramble out of the way, that's, you guys can't hear. Okay, let's just have a look and see if we've gotten some questions so I can help. Will you take guests on the stream? You may have seen that I've mentioned earlier he was in Ukraine. He is a fellow Irish fellow. I'm not Irish, I'm Northern Irish. Sorry to be pedantic on that, but I sent him a link. Yeah, I'm happy to have streams. Depending on Felix, if he's still in the chat. There's a couple of guys in Minsk. There's a guy in Tiraspol. I'd like to get on stream with Felix. If it's not able to appear on Felix's streams, I'd more than happy to have them on my own little independent streams. So I'm happy to take guests when and as I do streams as they go along. Very much interested to get Ben, the Ukrainian guy in Kiev. I'd like to get him back on a stream if he's up for it as well. So to try and expand this a bit from my own ramblings in manic thoughts and spurging them out at you, I'd like to try and expand that a bit and broaden the horizon, as it were. So just on that, so this what was the name of the guy? The Tsar experience. Yeah, I'm sure he could be an interesting discussion. Anyone seen footage of Azovians turning civilians back as they were trying to GTFO the using humanitarian corridor? I'd love to see it. Was referenced here. I've seen various reports of that over the past couple of weeks from the Russians. I don't speak the language, so I can't really verify what was said in the videos. And there's a number. Could it be that Azov is genuinely trying to hold civilians as hostages? I mean, that is plausible. I don't know how realistic that is. Could it be that fighting resumed around the humanitarian corridor, so they were just advising civilians not to drive into what could be an active battle? That could be another issue of it, but I haven't seen enough footage or sources on the ground to take a hard stance one way or another. So where exactly do we click to get to the live stream? Julie, I hope you figured out that issue, so you should be listening now. Hopefully, anyway. Who is going to win? What is going to happen to US, EU? I find the next week of World War Z. My assessment, and I've been strong in this assessment for a while, is I expect the Russians will win the military victory of sorts. I believe they have the equipment. I believe they have the intention, the manpower to win a victory that would mean that the Ukrainian army can no longer put up a sustained and organized resistance against them, and the realistic functioning of a Ukrainian state would collapse. So this would mean pretty much the Russians would take everything east of the Dnieper and start pushing heavily into Western Ukraine. Once the Russians start approaching the Romanian and the Polish borders, I think that's the point where you'll see those countries, but also maybe NATO in particular, will start putting pressure on Zelensky and the Ukrainian government that maybe it's time to seek some kind of settlement, because I don't think those countries are really interested in having Russian Guards divisions on their border. The other aspect that is, this is Russia's war to lose. I find it very hard, bar a complete collapse of the Russian state, to envisage a Ukrainian military victory. It's very hard for me to conceptualize how they could achieve that. So all the cards are in Russia's deck. It's Russia's war to lose as it stands. And I know this is very controversial with some people in chat, but the Russians up to this point haven't been winning it well. And what do I mean by that? The Russians are winning the war. It's just they could win the war a lot more effectively and efficiently if they worked out some of the problems they have. So in the first week of the invasion, the Russians were they were winning, but they were winning very badly. The improvements, because the Russians are improving as they go along with this, just by the nature of warfare, soldiers and commanders learn on the job, and the Russians historically and now seem to be fairly adept at doing that. I'd say that the Russians are winning the war okayishly, moderately. They're doing better, far better than what they did, but they could still very much improve upon it. The biggest aspects I would say is their logistics. The abandonment of vehicles issue has largely declined, and I think that's because the conscripts were pulled out. So we're not seeing masses of Russian vehicles being abandoned, but we are still seeing it happening. But instead of it just being a Russian vehicle randomly abandoned on a road, the instances where I'm seeing it is Russian vehicles have taken hits. So the crew might have thought that the vehicle was about to be destroyed, so the crew bailed out, or it's Russian vehicles becoming bogged down in the mud of the countryside, which is going to be a very big issue that the Russians will have to contend with going forward, because we are now rapidly coming into mud season. I need to stop saying but we're coming into mud season. I believe the Ukrainian and the Russian term for it is the rapitutsia, and forgive my horrific pronunciation of it. But essentially, the winter snows have melted. The ground is sodden. It's not frozen anymore. The ground is sodden. The mud is, and this has happened. You can see videos of it. Tanks can physically sink completely into the mud. It happened in World War II. There's instances happening now. The mud is sodden. There hasn't been too much rains, but the spring rains are rapidly approaching. Anything off of tarmac roads is going to be completely bogged down in mud. So the instances of Russian vehicles being abandoned, that's where it's happening, where I've seen it happen so far. So that is going to greatly restrict Russian movements and maneuvers across the country if they can barely use the countryside, at least until maybe mid to late April, whenever the summer approaches and the ground starts to dry out. So that's very much going to constrict the Russian operations going forward for another month, 2 months, month and a half or so. So that's one of the big aspects to keep an eye on. So let's have a look. What else have we got here? Let me have a quick look at the YouTube. Speaking of Felix, do you think the Russians will do a sea landing in Odessa, and if so, when? Yes, I do. But so for people who aren't aware, since the opening hours of the invasion, the Russian Black Sea Fleet has been shadowing ominously over Odessa. And pictures have come out of landing ships off the coast of Odessa. I believe there was some satellite footage came out today showing them forming up off Odessa. So there's a sizable Russian naval presence off Odessa. The Russian naval infantry and their marines haven't been seen fighting anywhere in Ukraine. I believe they did a landing on the Sea of Azov earlier in the war to try and cut off Ukrainian forces around Berdyansk, but the Ukrainians abandoned Berdyansk, so that was kind of moot, but they did do an amphibious landing there. So it is widely expected that the Russian Marines are all at sea, sitting off the coast of Odessa, preparing to do a naval landing on the city or to an area around the city. What I would expect they would do is, if the Russians are able to break through via Nikolaev, or they find a crossing across the Bug River somewhere further upstream from the city, and they start to approach Odessa from the north, I wouldn't expect the Russians will land straight into the city, because the city has just become a fortress. There's been footage coming out for weeks of Ukrainian civilians and Ukrainian military mining the beaches, putting up makeshift fortifications across the city. So I'd expect, if the Russians are able to get land forces from the north to push on Odessa, that would naturally force the Ukrainians to pull out their standing military units out of Odessa to see them off and mobilize the city's defenses to the north. my assessment is the Russians would then probably try and land the Marines and their forces to the south of the city. That would cause a lot of panic. I'm sure the Ukrainians are aware of it, but I don't think the Ukrainians just don't have the manpower or the equipment in the area to really see off both advances at the same time. So that could lead to collapse of organized Ukrainian resistance in Odessa Oblast itself. You could see this landing south of Odessa could attempt to push to the west of the city, link up with the forces pushing them from the north. Instead of the Russians trying to physically take Odessa like they're doing elsewhere, they'll just form a cauldron and encircle the city. And they could work it with artillery like they are in other cities, or they could just keep the Ukrainian forces and the civil population pocketed in the city, continue their operations elsewhere in the country, and just leave the city until some form of negotiated settlement can come to fruition. So that's what I would expect would be the logical game plan for the Russians to do with their naval forces in Odessa. But of course, it is logical. The Ukrainians are obviously aware of it. Who knows what tricks the Ukrainians could be trying to put in place for it. But from my understanding is most Ukrainian standing army forces in Odessa are badly needed elsewhere. So another aspect could be the Russians don't plan to land in Odessa at all. They're just keeping this naval force off the coast to keep Ukrainian military assets in the city so that they cannot join the battle elsewhere in Ukraine. That could be another aspect of what's happening there. So like, what else is here? Coach Kino Pill coming. I believe he was on Felix's stream earlier. It's another comment for someone tell CRP to stop making so much noise while he was eating. Was he eating on stream? Oh yeah, I seen some comments like that. He wasn't eating on stream, was he? Do you? Yeah, I'll answer that. What is the story behind the prime ministers of Poland, Estonia traveling by train to Kiev? I've only recently seen a couple bits on that. I guess it would play. I mean, I don't think the Russians would try to impede that, because if the Russians kill the head of governments of other countries, that's a very big escalation, especially the heads of NATO governments. It would play very big and very well for domestic populations back in Poland and Estonia. So maybe they're going to these frontline NATO states along the Baltics and Poland and maybe Slovakia, not Hungary for political reasons, but maybe Romania as well. Maybe they're viewing the rest of NATO, Western European NATO's response to what's happening in Ukraine is far too placid. And this is them planting their flag to say, okay, we're the front line of NATO. We're going to be proactive in Ukraine, towards the situation in Ukraine. We cannot depend on the French. We cannot depend on the Germans. Potentially, we can't depend on the British or the Americans either. So we're going to try and do our own sort of quasi pocket alliance within the wider aspect of NATO. So that could be an aspect of it. I don't know too much of the specific details of it to really give you a full conjecture on it or what that could be. But just off the top of my head, that could be two aspects of why those heads of government have gone to Kiev. Plus, also, it reassures the Ukrainians as well, the Ukrainian government. It could be trying to buoy up the Ukrainian government to try and continue on fighting, to say, look, we are here. We have come to Kiev. We've sent our heads of government to Kiev to show that we are supporting you as much as we can. So if you just keep fighting, we will try and give you the ability to continue resistance. That could be another aspect of it. Mariupol seems full course press to me. I apologize. I'm not too sure specifically what that comment is about. Russia said they want Alaska back. X'd out on that, but I could imagine some Russians might say that to try and cause a bit of consternation in Washington. Okay, where am I? Sorry, I'm trying to juggle between Telegram and YouTube at the moment, so just I do apologize again. I am new to this. It's not really a good excuse, but I'm hoping these streams will become more polished over time as I get more adept at hosting them. So, have I many tanks still hidden in lakes and muddy fields Yeah, that is true. Every now and again, it's quite incredible footage, but you can see it in Western Russia and in the Baltic states, where entire T-34s, German Stugs, can be fully recovered. The entire vehicles themselves, back in World War II, have physically just sunk straight into the mud. And modern tanks, yeah, I would say, yeah, especially Russian tanks. Western tanks tend to be heavier, but even the Russian tanks, the T-72 models, yeah, they would be heavy enough to completely sink into the mud in some cases. And there has been examples of that that I have seen where tanks have become half sunken into mud so far during this war. So it cannot be understated just how vicious a foe that the Ukrainian, the Belarusian, and the Western Russian mud can be at this time of year. I believe it was even called General Mud by, I think Napoleon called it that, and the Germans called it that whenever they had to deal with it. And it is kind of ironic that the Russians themselves are having to deal with what has historically been one of their greatest assets during wars. Hello, Michael. I was sent here from certain countries HQ. How are you doing? I'm doing relatively well, thank you. How are you doing? Do you think there's any truth in Putin being ill, cancer? He does look moon face bloated. I couldn't comment. I If Western sources are saying Putin has cancer, I'm going to put a big X to doubt on it. Personally, and I don't really have much to back this up on, but I do think we are probably seeing the beginning of the end of Putin's presidency. That's not to say that I think Putin's going to be overthrown, but I think Putin has, via this war, has kind of politically, he's probably looking at his legacy. He's looking at how the domestic opposition is in Russia, and he's probably, I would imagine that him, the inner circle in Moscow, maybe wider into the oligarch circles, they're probably coming to the conclusion that he's done this much for Russia, but he's been there for 20 years now, and this war has kind of broken the back of the populist Putin era, if that wasn't broken already. So maybe it's time to continue the system that he's put in place, the oligarchical system, the state that he has established and overseen. Maybe it's time to continue that system, but maybe for Putin to take a step back and we bring in a fresh face, maybe bring back Medvedev. There's some talk that maybe the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, could have been a potential successor. I think he's probably been a bit tarnished by the opening stages of the war, but I'm thinking that's probably an assessment that might be going on in Moscow in certain circles. That I don't say that Putin's going to be suffering a palace coup. No, I think this will be an agreed succession potentially, where Putin will step down, go off, enjoy his retirement, go off, enjoy his palace and the money he's gotten, still have an influence behind the scenes, sort of in a kind of in the way that Diocletian, to a degree, whenever he retired as Roman emperor, still for a number of years maintained power and influence behind the scenes as others held the reins of direct power. That could be a situation that comes about. But as I say, with what Russia is going to suffer through the sanctions and this complete economic, because the economic situation is going to become very dire in Russia. So they're going to have to make a large economic transition towards China, towards India, to the countries that haven't sanctioned them. So maybe this is a good bookend where maybe Russia could turn a leaf on the Putin era and bring in a new reformist. And as I say, I think the biggest thing that's always held Russia back was the corruption. So ideally, I would love, because I don't want Russia, I don't want Ukraine to do poorly. I like these countries. I'm very fond of the people that come from there. I like their cultures. So I'm don't wish ill on both countries. I think it's a tragedy that both of them are at war. But the biggest thing that's held both countries back, and especially Russia, has always been the corruption angle. So, ideally, I would love for some anti-corruption candidate to come in and really tackle that. But I'm skeptical if that's feasible. Any agreed successor of Putin, kind of by definition, is going to have to continue on the oligarchical system and the state apparatus that Yeltsin established, Putin helped build up and solidify. You know, I'm just not too optimistic about it. I'd like it to happen, but because I think Russia could really advance economically, I think it could genuinely reassert itself as a global power, maybe even a superpower if it just dealt with the corruption aspect. It's really put a stranglehold on Russian economic growth, Russian influence, just everything Russia has tried to do since the collapse of the USSR. It's done in spite of the corruption that's held it back in many ways. So, where else have we got? Think there will be a false flag chemical attack by Ukraine to try and draw NATO in, not like this happened in Syria, etc. I've spoken about this in a couple of streams and in the Telegram. Potentially, I guess it's plausible. I just don't think it's likely. And my reasoning for this is, could some Ukrainian national battalion fanatics get a very foolish idea in their head? Yeah, that's plausible. There was some talk about something in Kharkov, but nothing materialized of that. Could some overambitious Russian general or commander get a very foolish idea in his head as well? That's plausible as well. I mean, ultimately, I don't think the Ukrainian government is looking to basically pollute half the country with a radiological or a chemical or a biological false flag, because it's cutting your nose off to spite your face, and much can be said about the Ukrainian government. I don't think the Ukrainian government is that way inclined and has the mentality to do that. Some of the Ukrainian military units, namely the national battalions, yes, I could see that idea percolating through there. But at the same time, it's just, it's not a false flag artillery attack where you fire rockets into your own city. The ramifications of those kind of attacks, they last for decades, for centuries. And Ukraine already has Chernobyl. Does it really want another example of that, of another closed zone somewhere else in the country to contend with? I don't think the Ukrainian government's really, it is at war. Drastic things happen at war, during war, but I don't know. When it happens, it will happen, and I guess I'll have to make an assessment there. But it's plausible. I'm skeptical of the likelihood of it. But NATO has consistently, on NATO point, NATO has just consistently told Kiev, no, it will not get involved, because NATO wisely understands the ramifications of a NATO military intervention in Ukraine would necessitate direct conflict with Russia, and the only way that will end is either the Russians will have to resort to their nuclear capability, or the Russians will have to call the Chinese into the conflict, and then you're talking either nuclear war or World War III, and World War III could necessitate nuclear war anyway. So this is where I think, just trying to divert a bit off that specific topic, this is where I think Kiev and Ukraine were led down the garden path by the West, I think. Since 2014 especially, but over the longer term, is Western leaders, by the Bucharest summit in 2008 and various NATO summits and Washington and State Department meetings and declarations over the years, have put this idea in the Ukrainian mindset that Ukraine was a viable... Oh, I've just realized I'm going to have to go back and edit that out of this video. Okay, sorry, I've just realized that I've left something in the video that could be the reason why these streams get flagged on YouTube, so I'm going to have to go back and edit out of this background montage I've got going. But, so, going back to it, Western leaders, in my assessment, have basically walked Ukraine down a path and written them checks that the West could never conceivably cash. And the Ukrainians have found it out to their cost that the West was never able to live up to the promises and the expectations that they made to Kiev, because it appears, and it was strongly implied since 2014, that Ukraine would become a member of NATO, and Ukraine enshrined this in their constitution and in their basic law. And it was never feasible. It was never a feasible, realistic proposition for Ukrainian membership of NATO while there was a conflict in the Donbass and while Ukraine maintained claims over Crimea. But for whatever reason, as the West continued to walk Ukrainian policymakers down the road to say that even this rump Ukrainian state could still join NATO. And that obviously went down very badly in Russia, because the way that Russia tends to keep various countries from joining NATO is they're called frozen conflicts. So this is the situation with South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia. Georgia can never join NATO because it has claims onto basically de facto independent republics of Russian troops in them within its territory. Moldova can never join NATO and probably never join the EU because of the issue around Pridnestrovia. Forgive my pronunciation of that, but I've learned that Transnistria is not how it should be referred to. But the government in Tiraspol, because there's also Russian troops there to a degree guaranteeing its independence, that means Moldova is never going to be a realistic member of NATO. So the way the Russians thought, well, how can we keep Ukraine out of joining NATO? Let's prop up the Donbass republics, keep that conflict simmering to a degree. And foolishly, despite those situations going on in Ukraine, is NATO continued to talk up and increase its cooperation with Kiev. And the Russians, in their mindset, I assume, is that the way it was viewed in Moscow is that, oh God, is NATO really going to try and unilaterally bring Ukraine into NATO while these situations are going on? So I think that's why the Russians felt compelled, well, not the Russians, but rather Moscow in the Russian government and Putin felt compelled that they had to take this action in Ukraine. So I will quickly switch back and have a look at Telegram. Let's have a look if there is any questions in there. Where are we? Getting more solid. Well, yes, I've done that. I will take gas at some point. Maybe reopen the stream. Oh, the Russians seem to be stalling. The same areas are still contested. No major cities taken as of yet. How long can Russia keep this up? Again, I mean, I would consider Melitopol and Kherson to be fairly major cities. Kherson especially because it is the capital of one of the oblasts. Yeah, I think the Russians were surprised. I think most of us were surprised by just how effective in the resistance the Ukrainians were able to mobilize against them. And this was also compounded by, again, the incompetent way that the Russians conducted the invasions in the east of the country. And on just a second, I'm afraid my apologies, I've just got a apologies, I just had to check my phone there. So the way the Russians conducted the initial invasion, especially in the east and in Chernigov, was, I think I've said enough on it, so I'll not labor it too much, is they assumed that the Ukrainian army was going to be confused, not able to put up a decent resistance. They set in conscripts, which, especially in the east, caused a lot of problems for the Russians because the conscripts didn't know what they were doing. They got themselves into situations they shouldn't have. Ended badly for them. That kind of threw a spanner into the Russian advance in that area. So that's probably why Kharkov, Sumy, Chernigov was able to mobilize defenses enough to resist the Russians for so long. But saying that, in the south, and I still maintain, the Russian advance through Crimea from the south is by far the most professional, the most competent, the most successful Russian operations so far. They've advanced far. They've taken all their major objectives, day one objectives and first week objectives that I can see. The only thing that's holding them back is their logistics. But that force I've seen no evidence at all that there was ever any conscripts involved in it at all. So this is where I'm thinking, because of Putin instructing the military prosecutor to look into commanders who did this, I think maybe some military commanders in the various battle groups to the north and the east of Ukraine, they might have thought that they could get away with including conscript units as part of their battle groups. In the south, the commanders there, again, they seem to be very professional. They seem to be very competent. They're achieving their objectives. They've advanced far. Where they've met the Ukrainian army in the field is they've given a very good account of them. They've defeated them in the field. So this is, I know a lot of people in chat like to write me off as anti-Russian because I give this critique of the Russian army, but no, the Russian army in the south, very well equipped, very well organized, very well competent. If the other Russian battle groups were conducting themselves to the same extent as the one in the south was, I don't know. I think the Russians pretty much would have won the war by now. I think that would be a decent assessment. I think the southern battle group is the biggest problem that Ukraine faces. Probably larger than the encirclement of Kiev, because if the Russians can sort out the logistics and keep that battle group in the south mobile, keep it advancing, keeping it doing what it has been doing well so far, they could very easily outflank the entire Ukrainian military in the east of the country. They could rapidly overrun the south of the country. They could hollow out Ukraine from the south, conceivably, if they had the resources to keep their troops mobile to do it. They could probably encircle Zaporozhye, Kryvyi Rog, Dnipro. They could probably even start advancing on Kiev, conceivably, from the south. But the problem is obviously the logistics problem. Now, the question specifically, how long can Russia keep this up? I think Russia could probably realistically continue the war for years to come if they mobilize their economy. In terms of the large, rapid advances, I don't know if we've seen the end of that. I don't know if the Russians just aren't able to keep the fuel and supplies going into it. But if the Russians are really committed to it, yeah, they could sustain this war indefinitely. But it would be a slow war. It'd be a small piecemeal advances across bits of Ukraine in consolidating ground as they take it. So but that's just on the military aspect. The problem that the Russians have is the domestic aspect, is how long can they keep domestic opposition to the war? How long can, because there is going to be a massive economic hit coming to Russia, starting to make itself felt, but how long can this hobbled Russian economy sustain its military operations in Ukraine? Are the Russians able to transition enough economic power in trade towards India and China to sustain the military operations in Ukraine? These are all hypothetical, and ultimately, I guess we'll have to see how it goes. But as I was saying previously about the mud issue, is outside of tarmac roads, is the Russians are going to be very slow for at least the next month and a half until the summer sun comes along to start to dry out the mud in the countryside. So unless the Russians have something big planned, something big and decisive planned for the next week and a half, essentially until the spring rains start coming, the Russians are going to have to really dig in for at least another couple months long war. And the Ukrainians, I believe, they know this. This is why I would expect that Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, has authorized an extension of the martial law period from the 24th of March for another couple months after that. So the Ukrainians have obviously made the assessment that this is going to be going on for a while, for the near-term future. And looking at where the Russians are, I think the Russians have recognized that they themselves are not going to be able to win this war in the near-term future. So yeah, we could be looking at maybe 2 to 3 month war at least so far. And then that comes into, so the Russians are improving in the field, so the Russians are getting better at fighting the war, but that has to be played off against the fact that the Ukrainians themselves are getting better at fighting their war, and the Ukrainians are getting a lot of very effective Western equipment, mostly personally handheld equipment, which presents its own problems for the Russians, because the Russians have done well against the Ukrainians in the field so far, because the Ukrainians have been standing as a conventional force. The Ukrainians have been using their tanks. They've been dug in with vehicles and equipment in fortified positions. But I wouldn't be able to give an exact figure or percentage, but I would imagine most of those Ukrainian tanks, most of those Ukrainian vehicles have probably been destroyed already. So now the Ukrainian army is largely being relegated to an infantry based force. And I'm not saying this goes into guerrilla warfare, but that's a lot harder to fight than a tank and vehicle based force, because by its definition is they're harder to follow, they're harder to attack. Russian tanks can easily go up against Ukrainian tanks, but once you send Russian tanks into villages and into cities to try and fight Ukrainian infantry, that's whenever the Ukrainian infantry can really bring their Western anti-tank weaponry to effect. That's whenever that'll become the most effective. That's it's one thing, the Ukrainians having S-300 anti-air missiles in Buk at SAM systems, but as those get whittled down, as the Ukrainians increasingly are going to be relegated to relying on their Stingers, on their Ingeles, on their manned pads, and that's a lot harder for the Russians to deal with than the conventional long range SAM systems. So the Russians are winning the conventional war handedly, but via doing that is they're relegating themselves to fighting a more complex war with what is mostly going to be an infantry based Ukrainian force as a result of that. And that could then lead into potential guerrilla operations as hypothetical Ukrainian civilians start to take more active measures to oppose the Russians in areas that they occupy. So, like I say, the Russians are getting better. Their logistics is kind of improving. But is this improvement in the Russian capability enough to offset the continued supply of NATO equipment to Ukraine and the improvement that the Ukrainians are making in fighting their war? So that's the assessment you kind of have to keep an eye on there. So let's have a look. Nikolaev is holding strong. It appears to be. I think some supplies might have gotten into the city, but about 5 days ago to a week ago, yeah, it was very concerning for the Ukrainians in Nikolaev, to the extent that the Ukrainian forces in the city were asking the local civilians to provide them with military supplies, essentially. So I think that might have meant maybe the Ukrainian supply lines just weren't able to organize themselves to supply the effort in the city at that point. But I'm not seeing too much of that anymore. But the Russians do seem to be making small plays to the west of the city and artillery strikes on the city. It all depends if the Russians try to take the city itself or if they try to just go north, find a crossing elsewhere across the Bug River. But the problem is there's quite substantial Ukrainian forces in Nikolaev itself. If the main Russian advance in the south decides to just bypass the city entirely, until they completely encircle Nikolaev on the eastern side of the Bug, those Ukrainian forces there still present a big problem. They could launch various raids out of the city, which could really hamper Russian logistics and supply lines. That's an aspect in that city. But if the city does fall, or if it is encircled by the Russians, that opens up central Ukraine, gives the Russians the opportunity to advance to the borders of Moldova and Pridnestrovia, cut off all of Odessa Oblast and supplies coming up from the Romanian border via there. So it is a very strategic position and target for the Russians at the moment. There's some questions for other people. On who added me here? Bit of a shitpost. Now let's have a look. Missed some questions there, or Apologies, I think I might. Oh no, I'm looking at the general chat, not at the stream chat. Let's have a quick look. While I sort that out, let's have a look and see if there's a question in the YouTube chat. Just answered that one. He was eating. I'm assuming that is Gonzalo. Oh, I hate it whenever people eat on camera. I'm glad I wasn't there listening to it because that would have driven me up the wall. Okay. When will Kiev be encircled? Do you think the siege of Kiev is meant to work as a distraction for the Ukrainian forces when the real advance is in the east? I guess I'll just address the Kiev in general here. So Kiev is slowly being encircled to the west by the Russian forces coming out of Chernobyl. There's been very heavy fighting. The Russians have taken significant casualties, but they've also appeared to have dealt it some back to the Ukrainians themselves. But the Russians are slowly edging their way around the west of the city. But I think the big story about Kiev for the foreseeable future is the Russian forces that finally arrived out of Sumy Oblast in the past week around Brovary. I think that might be pronounced, but essentially eastern suburbs of Kiev. Those forces, that Russian advance column, advanced basically to it, met Ukrainian resistance, then pulled back and has sit tight since. That's because if you look at the more accurate maps about the situation in Ukraine, is that Russian advance is just one big long column stretching from the Russian border, going via around Sumy city, along that main highway all the way to Kiev. That column's very widely strung out. The supply lines are very stretched. It is very vulnerable to flanking attacks and to ambushes along the breadth of that column. So wisely, the Russian commander there has decided, okay, we've gone as far as we can go until we sort out our rear echelon issue, and until the battle group from Chernigov meets up to us, we're in no position to either take Kiev or try to encircle Kiev more to the east. So the Russians are probably building up strength there. The Russians are probably trying to achieve a breakout of Chernigov, but like I say, we hear very little out of that area for whatever reason. But if the Russians are able to link up with the troops out of Chernigov, that's a lot closer and a more sustainable supply line to keep the troops to the east of Kiev resupplied, supported. That's whenever you'll start to see the Russians making a larger play to the east of Kiev, and perhaps to make an encirclement of the city on the east of the Dnieper. That is going to draw away Ukrainian forces, most likely from the west of Kiev. That could let the Russians to the west of Kiev start to make more ground there. I don't know if the Russians would take the city or not. They could just put it into another encirclement and do what they're doing in Kharkov, where they're just... I know it's hard to say considering all the dead that's coming out of Kharkov, but the Russians could level Kharkov if they wanted to. If they wanted to do that, that city could have been reduced to rubble within the first week. I think the way the Russians are shelling Kharkov and other cities, yes, it is killing civilians and that's tragic and it shouldn't happen. But the way the Russians are going about it is it's sporadic shelling. It is MLRS barrages here and there. It is not continuous carpet bombing of the city. And I think that's part of the Russian ploy to encourage the civilian population to leave the city. That could be what the Russians want to do in Kiev. This could be what they learned from Syria. But then this would say that the Russians are in it for the long haul. Because people who aren't aware, the way the Syrian army and the Syrian government basically has mostly won the Syrian civil war is they encircled parts of cities, or they encircled cities and towns that were held by rebels, and they just besieged them for years. And they just kept up a steady stream of artillery and airstrikes on these cities until the local population and local rebel garrisons just said, right, we've been in this part of Damascus for 5-6 years now under constant artillery and airstrikes. We're not going to win here. Let's make an agreement with the Syrian government. We'll all evacuate to Idlib and other rebel-held areas. Are the Russians looking to do that? Potentially, I can see elements of that happen in Mariupol and to a degree in Erendogar and Kharkov as well, and Sumy and Chernigov. But I don't think the Russians are really looking to be in Ukraine for beyond 6 months or a year's long period. So how they plan to square that circle is another question. But that's what I think they could do that in Kiev. Like I say, that's what they're doing in Kharkov. That's what I think the aim of that artillery in Kharkov and the other cities are. They could do that in Kiev, but I mean, Kiev is a very big city. Territorially, it's a very big city. So how sustainable and feasible that could be, I think at some point the Russians might put it under siege for a few months, couple months, see if that weakens the local garrison there, and then maybe just try and take the city, because ultimately I can't see how the Russians could conceivably win, quote unquote, a war if they don't take Kiev. So that might have been a bit meandering, but I hope that addresses those two questions about Kiev there. Did you see Slava Intel post about the Canadian sniper supposedly killed today? Yeah, I posted that myself, but I posted with the caveat, be very skeptical of it, because it is a Russian claim. Until we get proper confirmation that that Canadian was killed by the Canadians themselves or the Ukrainians, just treat it with skepticism. It is the story that was going around is also that he somehow made it to Mariupol. If I'm not mistaken, he arrived in Ukraine after Mariupol was encircled. So how he would have gotten into the city, I'm skeptical of that. So just that specific claim about that Canadian sniper. In the same vein, whenever Ukraine claims it's killed various generals or the entire command staff of various army groups, just treat it with skepticism until there's more confirmation, especially by the side that those claims are made against, confirm it on their own. Maybe they're there to convince Zelensky to surrender. Now, I don't think I think they want to keep Ukraine fighting feasibly as long as they can up until the point the Russians are approaching their own borders. Given that China are already working on trade with Russia using alternative currencies, is the end of the dollar as king of all currencies coming? Have Western sanctions backfired? I think it has the potential to. Should give the caveat, I'm not a financial guy. I don't really understand how currencies work and geostrategy. I don't really understand the ramifications of the petrodollar and stuff like that. I can only give you my grug brain take on it. I'm not an expert in this, but I can give you my take on it. But yeah, I do think Western sanctions, especially American sanctions, are looking at the moment to be backfiring. And India is being the big example of this. I've seen reports that India has. I spoke in a previous stream, so I don't particularly want to go over the entire Indian situation again. I apologize with this. I don't want to cop out, but I just don't want to keep repeating myself in every stream on this specific issue or other issues. But India, just the long and short of it, it has far closer ties with Russia going back to the Soviet days than it does with the United States for various reasons. The United States historically has been a big supplier of military weaponry to Pakistan. Anyone who knows anything about Indian geopolitics, the biggest big threat to India is Pakistan, so the Indians aren't too happy about that. Afghanistan, the United States pulled out, left all their weapons in Afghanistan. Lots of those weapons are going to find their way into Kashmir and into Islamic terrorists in India, so the Indians are not very happy with that as well. So whenever the United States started to threaten India that they were going to subject India to sanctions because India maintains quite close ties with Russia, they buy a lot of Russian weapons. They've abstained on the UN votes regarding Ukraine. So that's the background of this. But from my understanding is India is talking about paying for Russian oil in rupees, in Indian rupees, which is quite significant because the Russian ruble is, I wouldn't say it's junk, but it's not really going to be a very viable global reserve currency anymore. So the Russians, especially considering the United States has said it's going to try and just completely block the ability for the use of the dollar in Russia. This, to me, is quite significant because the Russians are going to need foreign currency, and if they can get it via Indian rupees, that could be a very, most international trade is done in dollars to some degree. So if the Indians and the Russians are just looking to completely bypass that is quite a, I wouldn't say a win, because where Russia was to begin with, but it mitigates. It's a good story to mitigate the economic damage that the sanctions are going to have on Russia, and it's also a good diplomatic story in favor in Russia's cap to say we are not isolated in the world. Is the United States is trying to isolate us, but there are countries out there that are pushing back against the United States against this. So that's in regards to India. China, yeah, again, I've kind of spoken about this at length in different places, but yeah, I believe the Chinese are starting to talk about paying for Saudi oil in renminbi and yuan, which would be quite significant because would be a very big challenge to the petrodollar. So, as I said earlier in the chat, is I do think Russia is going to come out of this entire affair a diminished global power. But ironically, the United States is going to come out a diminished global power as well, because I think the Americans and the Biden regime has conducted itself with a certain level of arrogance. That might be the correct word. It assumed that it was able to force its diplomatic will and economic will on other countries to an extent that it just can't anymore after Afghanistan and after the pandemic. I don't know if I've said this on some of Felix's streams, but I believe the pandemic will be viewed historically as the point where China has become a global superpower, as a full contender of the United States. And I think the United States and certain Western governments have yet to kind of wake up to that fact, is that China is widely viewed, and to a large degree I would agree, although it does have very big issues, that China is the rising power, and the United States, especially since Biden has come into power, is now what is viewed across many parts of the world as being in relative decline. So various governments like the Saudis, like the Indians, are probably making the assessment, why should we hitch our wagon to a country that is looking to be in decline whenever we can diversify our diplomatic, economic, and military alliances with countries that might be on the up? So that's why I think the Saudis especially have really, I don't know if embarrassed would be the correct word, but they've really thrown a curveball at the United States with some of the statements they've come out with, very much so. So that, going back to the end of the dollar is the king of all currencies, yeah, this could be, we could be seeing the beginnings of a multi-currency world, where instead of the dollar being the hegemonic reserve world currency, where there's a lot more competition there. But again, that's with the caveat that I don't really know too much about finances and stuff like that. It in financial instruments, it's not an area of expertise with me, so that's just kind of my novice understanding take on it. You mentioned that nothing was really happening on the fronts, but you didn't mention Mariupol. I mean, Mariupol is under siege. From what I've seen, the Russian army itself isn't really making big plays on Mariupol. It's the Donetsk militia, the Donetsk army, that's really pushing into the city, and they are making gains, but they are taking significant losses at that. So that's the situation of Mariupol, from my understanding as it's so far. That is because the Azov battalion and the Donetsk battalions have very bad blood with each other going back to the 2014 war. Both sides committed atrocities against each other. They have very, very dim views on prisoners that they take from one another. And like I say, you're talking about 8 years of bad blood that both sides have on each other. And Mariupol as well has very special significance for the Donetsk Republic. So they're very eager to show that they themselves have captured and taken that city, and not only taken the city, but quote unquote liberated it from Azov. So that's why you're probably seeing the DNR especially very keen to go into the city and physically take it, whereas the Russian military is happy to assist here and there. But I haven't seen too much evidence that the Russian army is really committed to going into the city themselves. They're probably just like of the assumption, we'll let the Donetsk soldiers do the heavy lifting, we'll support them, but our main focus is elsewhere. Let's save our strength and equipment for battles yet to come. Are the Russians holding all Armata advanced tanks for home defense? No, in terms of things like the Armata and the more recent Russian equipment like the Su-57 and weapon systems like this is stuff that's probably just so advanced that the Russians don't want to risk it in battle at the moment. Unless it's a very, very controlled situation where the Russians have overwhelming control and they know specifically what the Ukrainians have in a very localized area. The Russians might deploy an Armata or two for battlefield testing, but I do not expect, unless things go really bad, that the Russians would start deploying this kind of equipment to the battlefield, because the Russians lose this. If they lose these tanks, one, it'll be very embarrassing for them if they're destroyed in battle for whatever reason. But if they get captured, it kind of negates the entire factor behind the Armata, because then the Ukrainians immediately would ship it, or whatever they could of it, back across the border into NATO, and NATO specialists would just start picking over every single bit of it, and that's the Armata. The kind of fear factor of the Armata, as it were, kind of scundered there already. If NATO gets their hands on a copy or the wreck of one, they can pull it apart, find out its weaknesses, and so that's why generally in wars such as this, Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, to a degree, is countries don't tend to deploy their ultra modern equipment. Also got. Have you got a Bohanka full of? I wish I had a Bohanka full of physical silver someday. Someday, if Facebook, if YouTube ever gives me the opportunity to super chat, maybe I'll use some of. Maybe I'll grift. Maybe I'll join the grift, the YouTube grift that all the fellow racist YouTubers do, and I'll use that money to buy a silver-plated Bohanka at some point. You are far too concerned with how it will economically affect Russia. It's going to hurt the West more so in the long game. Skeptical of that. I think it's going to be a very... I mean, I'm not in favor of the Russian invasion, so I need to get that preface out the door to begin with. But part of me very much hopes that Russia is able to... How can I coach this without it sounding the way it's going to sound? I hope the sanctions don't destroy Russia. I hope Russia is able to bear the sanctions and over time do well in spite of the sanctions. Because I would like to see how a country like Russia because the only other countries similar to Russia in terms of sanctions is Iran, North Korea, and Cuba. Two of those countries have normally Marxist-Leninist economic systems, so they don't really have... They have markets to a degree, but they don't have... The point I'm getting at is Russia is so large, and it's kind of integral to the global economy to such a degree, but it also has a market economy of a certain degree, although there is issues with it. I would like to see if that economy is able to sustain itself and to survive outside of the economic influence of the United States and Western global economic bodies. So if Russia is able to sustain itself and eventually make a quote unquote success of its economy out of despite the sanctions. I mean, to me, that would say, okay, well, if Russia is able to do it, because Russia is such a large country, it's not some rinky dink third world, second world communist dictatorship or Islamic theocracy. It's Russia. It is a large global power. If it is able to do it, then that kind of says that this myth of globalism, of economic globalism, of the economic model since 1991, of just unfettered access of unfettered access of people, capital, labor, in culture, that can be broken. That this illusion that this is the way the global economy works, and if you're not part of the global economy, you will not succeed. So therefore, you have to sign up to American cultural influence. Therefore, you have to sign up to European-based international treaties. Therefore, you have to sign up to the IMF. If you don't sign up to these, you'll not survive. If Russia's able to overcome that, then that kind of breaks the aura that for much of the world, that the way the West dictates global economics is run and global diplomacy is run. It breaks that illusion, which I think is something that needs to be broken. Just from my own personal political slant. Anti-corruption just gets assassinated. I'm assuming we're talking about Russia. Yeah, I know it's unfortunate, but have you read Julius Caesar's Conquest of Gaul? If so, what did you think of it? I'm afraid no, I haven't read it. I'm aware of it. I know passages of it, but I haven't read it, so I couldn't give you a educated take on it. Any word on the Ukraine troops being surrounded by Russians? I mean, I'm assuming you're talking about the Donbass and not the other encirclements. But in the Donbass, the Russians are doing it rather slowly, a lot slower than I would have thought, which is probably giving the Ukrainians a lot of time to pull out most of their troops. But it does appear that the Russians have finally encircled a section of eastern Ukraine, far eastern Ukraine, that kind of splits off into Russia. In the far east and north of Luhansk Oblast. But I don't think there's really going to be much Ukrainian military personnel or equipment there to begin with. If the Russians are able to achieve the breakthrough in the south of Kharkov Oblast and the Russians north of Mariupol are able to push to the north, yeah, they should be able to pocket the Ukrainian forces in the Donbass, which would be a very significant victory for them. That is, although it's diminishing by the day, because you can bet that the Ukrainians are well aware of this, so they're slowly retreating their forces out of it. But if the Russians are able to do that, if the entire Donbass is handed over to the two republics, that's a very big political victory for Moscow and a ceremonial victory. It would mean the strongest Ukrainian defensive positions, because don't forget, these places have been fortified for 8 years since the war in 2014. It will take them out of play, could open up the war to a bit more of a war of movement in the Donbass, in eastern Ukraine. The mud situation aside. So, but again, this is something that I was expecting while looking at it, that the Russians could have achieved within the first week. But they're making very slow progress of it for whatever reason, here, there, or the other. Okay. What sort of food does one have to eat to update machine like yourself? I mean, crikey, yeah, I can't let this stream go on for 3 hours because I need to eat today, but a very bad diet. I mostly drink Coke Zero, some takeaway food, although I did cook myself some sweet potatoes, so I am trying to make a bit more time for myself to make allowance for me to actually cook my own food instead of constantly resorting to takeaways and Coke. I wouldn't take my diet as something to base your diet off of. That's what everyone has been looking the other way the whole time, because they get their resources from Russia. Yeah, I mean,
I think Russia is going to take a very big economic hit. Could be comparable to the collapse of the Soviet Union kind of hit, the sort of 90s scale of economic crisis. But the West is going to be hit as well. Is loads of us who live in the West, I mean, I'm sure we've been painfully made aware of just how much the price of electricity, the price of fuel is going up. Oh, the price of bread is going to be going up because fertilizers, cereals, all the stuff that generally comes out of Russia or Ukraine, it's it's going to have a big impact on the market. So there's going to be a very hard transition for Western economies to get off of this stuff, to transition from Russian producers, if they ever reasonably can. So, I mean, I'm not. There is this assumption that seems to go on in chat because I give these critiques of Russia. I am somehow fanatically anti-Russian, or I'm constantly doing down Russia or stuff like this. No, the focus tends to be on Russia. So whenever I give my critique of Russia, I'm not doing it from a political bias because, like I say, in many respects, I'm quite sympathetic to Russia. I can understand why they felt compelled to launch the invasion. I'm just not in favor of the invasion. You know, I if anything, I would say I have a very strong political bias against the West, against NATO. It's just I am giving my takes on what I see and what I perceive to be their critiques. I am critiquing what I see from Russia as I critique what I see from Ukraine. I'm not being critical for the point of, I'm not giving undue criticism from what I can see. Like I say, I'm just addressing what I see. I don't bring my political bias into it. But yeah, I mean, the Western economies will be hit quite strongly out of this. The United States, I mean, for Americans, I'm sure just go down and look at the increase of gas. And we already had an inflation problem coming out of the pandemic. The pandemic, it caused various supply line shortages and inflation problems. And now you've got Russia, this whole Russian situation it's like I say, to a degree, it's kind of the return of history. This idea of a constantly improving quality of living for each generation and ever sustainable economic growth. I think that is going to be challenged for at least the next decade as we come to deal with the ramifications of Ukraine, the pandemic, and other issues coming down the line. But definitely, like, there will be a fuel and energy crisis in the near future, if not already taking effect in the West. So, if China takes Taiwan, which wouldn't be easy, but how badly will this cripple the dollar even more? And it's just very hypothetical at the moment. I don't, short of NATO and Russia going to war, I don't think the Chinese have any immediate, medium term prospects of. Fucks. Sorry, hold on a second. I've got a phone call and I'll be back in a sec. Oh, sorry for that. I swear it's certain people out there must only wait until I'm on stream before they call me or knock the door or whatever. But apologies for that. What were we talking? China, yes, yes. So Taiwan, I don't think the Chinese Navy, the People's Liberation Army Navy, is anywhere has the capability to effect an invasion of Taiwan for at least another decade or so. So I don't think it's really on the cards unless NATO and Russia go to war, which then makes the Americans look elsewhere and not have the American naval fleets going around the Strait of Taiwan. That's whenever I expect you'll probably see the Chinese might feel this is their only chance to do it. But to pull off a properly successful invasion of Taiwan, I don't think the Liberation Army is capable to do it, while the United States also has a fairly substantial interest in the area. If the United States is distracted by a major war in Europe, which it is physically engaged in, yeah, that might be whenever the Chinese feel that, okay, this is our best chance. This is the time to make the play for it. So let's have a quick look. Where am I? Is Russia still selling oil and gas to the EU? Also, wood imports have been increasing. From my understanding, I think some countries might still be taking oil and gas from Russia. I'm not too sure if the European Union sanctions are binding yet. I honestly can't give you a direct answer on that. But I know the Hungarians and I think the Bulgarians as well were specifically saying that they're not keen on joining the EU sanctions because they're reliant on Russian hydrocarbons. Plus, also, Hungary is a diplomatic ally of Russia to a large degree. I think Russia will economically go back straight to the 90s in just under 5 years. Yeah, I mean, it is. If anything, it might even be worse than the collapse of the USSR because the USSR was kind of a long, drawn-out stagnation through the 80s, and then the shock conversion to capitalism was kind of drawn out over the space of a year through 93, 94, 95. This is all going to hit Russia, in the space of 6 months. So it'll be interesting to see just how badly it damages the Russian economy and how much the Russian government is able to mitigate it. Volnovka looked brutal. Yes, it did. That battle, yeah, and that a couple of days ago, 3-4 days ago, there was a lot of posting on Twitter, as there usually was, saying that the Ukrainian army had broken the siege of Mariupol. The Azov battalion has been freed, and the Russian army is in full retreat across the Donbass. And I hate to be that kind of guy who's like, excuse me, have you got a citation for that? And no, none of them did have a citation for that. And if anything, it was Volnovka. Volnovka, that's how I'd pronounce it. Volnovka had fallen to the forces of the Donetsk People's Republic. And if you look at a map, if you look at Volnovka, it had fallen. And the fact that Volnovka has fallen, it completely negates any possibility of any serious attempt by the Ukrainians to break the siege of Mariupol. It was a stronghold of the Ukrainian army in the area. The fighting looked to be very vicious there. Lots of Ukrainian equipment and tanks were captured there. Ukraine took significant casualties there. I'm sure the DNR did as well, but it was the final nail in the coffin for Mariupol. Unless there is some spectacular collapse of the Russians in Kherson and around Berdyansk, it's just not feasible to see how Ukraine could ever lift the siege of Mariupol. So all these Twitter experts and blue check marks that were singing the praises of the Ukrainian army for lifting the siege of Mariupol, I mean, yeah, this is why you don't look at Western media or use Twitter as a source, because it's another case where the exact opposite has happened. Like this, just like in the opening days of the war, whenever there was the story going around that the Ukrainians had retaken Gostomel and defeated the Russian VDV, and then whenever you looked at what actually happened, it was basically the opposite of it. So that seemed to be the story there. If millennial, yeah, an old friend of mine, less said about him the better, can quit coke, then so can anyone. Yeah, I mean, there's times where I just go off coke for a month or so. The problem is where I am at the moment is the tap water doesn't taste the best. I would usually, whenever I'm at the computer, I'd try and drink a lot of water, but like I say, the tap water here I just really don't like the taste of it, so I'm having to, as I've got right here, a can of Coke. Coke Zero. That's the one good thing, is I was able to completely kick normal Coke, so I never drink normal Coke. I drink Coke Zero. I don't know if you guys would consider that much better or not, but that's kind of what I drink at the moment. That in water and cordial. So I might get into the habit of buying bottled water, but generally I can kick Coke whenever I want to, but it genuinely probably is like my one addiction. Is I do get a craving for Coke Zero if I haven't had it for a while, but I am able to drop it for a month or so. I just then relapse back into drinking it. So let's have a look. In fact, I tell you what, I'm going to nip over to Telegram. Let's see any of the Telegram questions. Michael, do you know the source of that video of the Yank explaining his experience fleeing? Would like to know what else he had to say. No, I'm afraid not. Someone posted it in the chat. I had a look at it, and all I know is it came from Twitter. I haven't looked too deeply into it, and that was just within the last couple hours or so. It's a question for someone else. When will you remove chat? T, you don't like chat, and I'm not going to lie, I was not a big fan of chat yesterday. I'm not minded to remove chat. And I don't want to say stuff that could encourage people to do stuff that would get chat removed, but the chat has its values, and when chat is able to, chat is always right. I love you, chat. We might have an acrimonious relationship at times, especially whenever people from chat try to call me at 5 a.m. But chat can have its uses. There's some knowledgeable people in chat. It's good for people calling me out whenever I make a mistake, because I do make mistakes. I will make mistakes. Chat's good at seeing that. There's some very knowledgeable people in chat. There's people on the ground in Ukraine and surrounding countries that I've come to know through chat who I'd like to get on stream. So I mean, I'm not minded to delete chat. It's just whenever people, for whatever reason, get so invested, they're going to start doxing people or just other idiotic stuff, or like I say, calling me up in the middle of the morning while I'm trying to sleep to complain that they're getting trolled on chat. It's stuff like that. Just, if we could, I don't know what happened the past couple days, but before that, yeah, chat was cantankerous at times, but generally it was good at regulating itself. I just don't know what happened the past couple days. I don't know if new people joined or what, but it's been better today. But yesterday, really, I was not a fan of chat. It's an interesting thing that was prominent. People were saying that the Russians wouldn't keep up an offensive for more than 10 days. I think they're capable of much more now, that they're forging closer ties with Russia and India when Russia is getting paid for their oil and gas. World, I think I've kind of addressed that earlier in the chat. So your verbal tics are very minimal. I mean, the biggest verbal tic is my accent, but thank you, I appreciate it. China inching closer to Saudi Arabia as we speak. Yeah, so just to quickly round off the Saudi issue. As I say, the United States is in relative decline. Afghanistan especially sent a big message to the Gulf states that the United States, when push comes to shove, is not really going to be there to back you up. And there's also this sort of Cold War going on in the Middle East between Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. So I think if the United States cannot, or Saudi Arabia is also fighting a war that's kind of astounding how badly they've been fighting it for about 3-4 years now against the Houthis in Yemen, to such an extent that the Houthis are launching missiles and drone strikes into Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia. For people who don't know, like Riyadh, I believe it's like 600 miles across pure desert from Yemen. So maybe the Saudis are just looking for more dependable, if that's the right word, dependable allies than the United States at this stage, or just trying to diversify their military and diplomatic and economic ties away from Washington, as they kind of see the long-term writing on the wall. That could be it. I can't agree with, who's this towards? Oh, it's about Gonzalo. What chance is there Russian being able to win the peace? They take Ukraine peaceably and they're able to set up friendly Ukrainian governments. I'm doubtful, because a very significant portion of Ukraine now despise Russia. It's not confined to the the fringes of Right Sector and of Azov and groups like that, is this invasion, while there was sort of like a general kind of hostility towards Russia, now a lot of Ukrainians actively despise Russia. And it's all hypothetical, but a state that Russia, if Russia puts up some form of client state in Ukraine, it's hard to see how that could really be viewed legitimate, not only diplomatically, but by the Ukrainian population. I don't know. It's just pure conjecture at this point. There's so many different variables, and it all depends on how the war goes and how NATO is going to react to it. It's I could be here for hours just giving off various hypotheticals and conjectures on it. I don't want this to sound like a cop out, but I honestly wouldn't know how to answer that without going into like a 2-hour tangent on it. I apologize. From what Coach Red Pill said, apparently Ukrainian command and control are partially broken. I understand how much that's true and valuable. The Western satellites so claimed might get cut off in eastern Ukraine. I mean, yeah, the opening salvos of the Russian invasion definitely hit the Ukrainian command and control, but it didn't destroy it. And if anything, the Ukrainians have rallied and solidified their defenses, especially as this Russian advances have largely slowed over the past week. I mean, that the Ukrainians have, it's not the case that the Russians have slowed and they're trying to sort out their logistics, so the Ukrainians have just been static. No, the Ukrainians are doing stuff on their end. They're digging in, they're rebuilding supply lines, especially into Nikolaev in examples like this. So any damage to Ukrainian command and control by the opening strikes, I think that's long since been patched up and accommodated for. The problem is because of the nature of the Russian advance in areas like Chernigov and Sumy and to a degree Kharkov Oblast, is you have Ukrainian military units behind the lines, so to speak, that might be out of contact with wider Ukrainian command. That could be an aspect, and they could be the ones who are causing real havoc for the Russian supply lines behind the lines, setting up ambushes and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, yeah, and I haven't really watched Gonzalo's streams, but I do get the sense that he is very openly and knowingly, uncritically putting forward one side of the conflict and not really critically looking at the wider picture. That's the sense I'm getting from what I keep hearing he's saying. I'll have to sit down. The problem is like I say, I'm doing this pretty much as soon as I wake up to almost as soon as I go to sleep. At some point I am going to have to take a step back from this because I need to earn money. And I've kind of forsaken earning money for the past 3 weeks. But at the moment I just don't have time to sit down and watch people's streams, but I will. Certainly a lot of people speak about Gonzalo, and I have spoken about Gonzalo myself. I guess it is only right that I actually sit down and watch what he says. So I will have to endeavor to do that at some point. Reaction to Redditors being crushed and bombed to oblivion where they belong. On a more serious note, though, in your estimation, are the Russians going to start to try to take more cities? Just keep encircling them and try to avoid a Grozny situation? Or, I mean, I think where the Russians can reasonably snap a city by surprise, yeah, they'll do that. If there's significant resistance in the city, yeah, the Russians will encircle it. They'll put it into a castle. That's the German term for it, but they'll encircle it. I believe cauldron is sometimes the terms. They'll kettle them. I think is I'm probably using the police term of kettling here, but they'll kettle a city. They'll encamp around it, stop anything coming in, let civilians leave when and as they can. But just there, slowly turn up the pressure and the heat via artillery and just hope the cities will give in themselves. Like I say, it depends how long the Russians really anticipate they are willing to stay in Ukraine. But through looking at what they're doing in the cities, I would say if you want to see what that could look like, probably look at like the siege of Homs the siege of Aleppo, the siege of, I think it was Yarmouk or Al Quds. I think it was Yarmouk, of Yarmouk camp in Damascus. The way the Russians and the Syrian army dealt with rebel held urban areas in Dara and places like that during the Syrian civil war, which is probably why the Russians seem to be talking up the idea of bringing in Syrian troops, because I know a lot of people like to poo poo them, but I mean the elite elements of the Syrian army, not the conscripts and stuff, but the actual professional Syrian soldiers, they've been fighting for, what would it be, almost 12 years now, and a lot of that will have been urban warfare. So they'll be very skilled at urban conflict. So that's probably why they're very, and also the fact that the Free Syrian Army seems to be sending troops to fight for Ukraine. That's why the Russians are probably looking at potentially bringing in the Syrians themselves. Also, just I mean, if Redditors want to go and get themselves killed, I mean, Redditors are welcome to go and get themselves killed. Um, I'm not going to laugh at people dying, especially ex-veterans and stuff, because I mean, a lot of ex-veterans who go out to Ukraine, yeah, I do think they themselves are going out for noble causes in their minds, at least. They are just finding themselves in a war that they have never, that their experience of war in Afghanistan and Iraq is completely different to the war they're going to be fighting in Ukraine. Because in Iraq and Afghanistan, I think I've said this a few times in a couple of other streams, is the wars they fought there, they were the ones with the overwhelming advantage. They were the ones with artillery on demand. They were the ones with the armor, with the tanks, with the armored vehicles. They were the ones with UAVs and airstrikes on demand. In Ukraine, they aren't. They're the ones on the back foot, and the Russians made a very, very big demonstration of that whenever they hit that Legionnaire training facility. Coach Red Pill was definitely eating on. Oh God, I oh I really triggers me. I don't know if it's. I'm not actually autistic. I just meme autistic a lot, but I don't know if it's like the autism in me. But whenever I hear people eating and the slapping of lips and stuff, it just yeah, really drives me up the walls. So I'm probably not going to watch that stream for that reason. Pineapple on pizza, yes or no? It depends what type of pizza, if I'm going to be honest. But I do like pineapple on pizza or not on pizza. Either way, I do like pineapple. It's very good in the cocktails I make it with. Have you seen the briefings on illegal Pentagon? Could have been a Freudian slip there. Pentagon bioweapons program. Russians are accusing. I mean, I have heard about it, and I've kind of made my views clear on it a number of times. I don't wish to keep going over the same issue. My stance on the bioweapon stuff, I don't think the US is running a. I could be wrong. The stories are changing seemingly every other day once new stuff comes out. But from my understanding and what I could believe, I find the idea that the US is running like a secret biological weapons program out of Ukraine. I'm skeptical of that. What I can perfectly see is Ukraine is a former Soviet republic. It has, from that legacy, and it's built up since independence, is it has a fairly substantial health sector, medical education sector. This is why you have all the foreign students up in Sumny, because a lot of them would have come to train as doctors and nurses. Through the Soviet legacy and this medical education system is you'll have a fairly developed healthcare industry, and any country with any fairly developed healthcare industry is almost by definition is going to have virology labs, it's going to have pharmaceutical production facilities in development labs and stuff like that. So that's what I think what these quote unquote bio labs are. That is what I'm ascribing to them at the moment. Once more stuff comes out, yeah, I will assess it. But like I say, at the moment, I'm just skeptical that it depends what you mean by biolab, but I'm skeptical of the idea that, these are biological weapons programs, because don't forget, we are at the tail end of a global pandemic. So Ukraine, obviously, their biological laboratories and virology institutes and stuff like that, they themselves would have gotten a lot of investment here, there, and everywhere. And the other aspect is American investment in this stuff is, I would imagine, the standards, the legislation, and the standards for various testings and developments of vaccines or various medical products is probably lower in Ukraine than it is in the United States. So you'll probably find American corporations and entities will probably fund to have research done there, where it's probably cheaper and the laws are a bit more forgiving towards it. Question for someone else: what happened to the Syrians that Russia hired for urban war? I think I've just kind of answered that there now. I never had doubt about a Russian military victory. I found it really upsetting how disingenuous guys like Gonzalo Liras claim every time the Russians are not blasting. That narrative is so pro. Again, I've only watched bits of it, so I honestly couldn't say. But the bits I have watched, it is very. It does sound very RT of some of the talking points that Gonzalo is coming out with, and like I say, the Russian telegrams that I seen whenever they were talking about him were very, very fond of Gonzalo for the stuff he was saying. Let's have a look. As an aside, do you think the very recent Spurgeon in chat is done on purpose? By no, I know. I think it. I don't think I'm big enough for anything. I wouldn't. I don't have a big enough ego to imagine anything like that. I just think it was a couple of people. Some people in chat just got very emotional and very over invested in having a fight, an internet war with other people in chat. Do you think Russia will consider building a new type of fuel tank vehicle that uses tank tractor tracks? I mean, they do. I believe there's certain patterns of the MTLB. Is that MTLB? Yeah, I believe there's certain patterns of the MTLB, but ultimately, I mean, I'm not too sure what you're asking there, because I mean, fuel trucks work just as well if they're properly maintained and if you have the area secured enough so that they're not going to get ambushed. But I mean, I'm pretty sure there are sort of battlefield refueling vehicles. Like I say, I believe the MTLB has certain patterns equipped for that. Are you following the economic war? China, I think I've kind of addressed that in previous conversation earlier in the stream. Question for someone else. Guess I got to learn Mandarin. Yes, I would recommend that. 谢谢. 你好吗? 中国. Yeah, Mandarin's always. I should really get back to trying to learn it. I was learning it until the world ended. Yeah, let's have a look. Corruption is part and parcel of Eastern Europe. Sadly, I doubt it can be easily rectified by anyone or anything or anyone. The power. Yeah, I mean, corruption is it's unfortunately a part of human nature, and I mean, corruption happens in the West. It's just a different type of corruption. It's the government contract. We're going to pay Raytheon so many billions of dollars, and then we're going to support certain conflicts over war overseas that Raytheon happens to sell weapons to. Kind of corruption. In Russia, there is that corruption, but there's also just the visceral. The police officer might ask you for so many rubles to waive a fine. The local administration might ask for a backhand to legalize your business, kind of thing. If you want to set up a new factory plant, the local rayon or oblast government might ask so many rubles for you to get planning permission. It's that's the kind of corruption that really hollows out a regime. It's the kind, the corruption in the West, it's kind of detached from the people because the numbers are so large, and it's done via legislation and backroom dealings. In Russia, it's generally the people themselves experience it. It's different whenever you hear like so many billions from the state budget have over the years gone here, there, or everywhere, and then you personally being told, yeah, you need to pay this on top of the legal amount to do something or have something approved. That's the kind of visceral corruption that it's gotten better in Russia since the 1990s, but it's still very much there, and it's very much a feature of the upper echelons of the administration. And that, yeah, it's unfortunately, it seems to be a big thing just in Eastern Europe, especially. What else have we got? Having a chat. Situation is very similar to what happened to Poland World War II. The Allies give you assurances they couldn't keep. Behind the scenes, the Poles told that Germany potentially. What's your take on the peace talks? Do you think there's a chance of peace agreement in the next 2 weeks to May? I haven't really been following it because both sides are clearly digging in for a sustained military campaign. So I think that kind of demonstrates to me peace talks aren't really on the situation. And ultimately, until Zelensky and the Ukrainian government is willing to concede Crimea, NATO, and the Donbass, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians throw in maybe Kherson and Kharkov or something else to that. Until Kiev is able to swallow that pill, is the Russians are almost certainly going to carry on their military campaign until essentially Ukraine collapses or until Russia collapses. And ultimately, Ukraine looks far more likely to collapse in the near future than the other. So I'm not overly optimistic about the negotiations. Negotiations will probably work out certain evacuation routes from cities in maybe localized ceasefires, but in terms of actually stopping the war, no, I don't have much hope about it. I think it's only going to come about once the Russians physically have to militarily force the Ukrainian government to come to terms. And then that adds up the problem. Zelensky's probably viewed like a god at the moment in Ukraine because of the way he's stood up for the nation during the war. But if Zelensky has to sign a peace like that, I don't know what the feeling in Ukraine is like or what it would be like, but I can't see any Ukrainian government that concedes such essentially humiliating peace terms to Russia is viable or sustainable. Pardon me. My Coke Zero chat, it's giving me the hiccups. It's another reason to kick it. Maybe this is why I should go to Russia. They have no Coke anymore. Detox in Russia. Or Belarus. I don't know. I think I'd probably like to probably prefer Belarus more than Russia. Belarus looks more cozy and clean, to be honest, than Russia. Although I'm sure Russia would be a good place to experience. Earlier, you mentioned cutting off your nose to spite your face regarding nuclear option. Do you feel NATO has done the same thing, overplayed its hand in Ukraine, encouraging? Yes, yeah, I think NATO overplayed its hand, and yeah, again, I think it made promises to Ukraine that it didn't expect to write or to keep in the end. So yeah, I very much think that NATO and the West has overplayed their hands in Ukraine massively, and as I say, ultimately they led Kiev and the Ukrainians down the river, and the hubris and arrogance of policymakers in Brussels and in Washington are now being paid for by the blood of Ukrainians and Russians. And I mean, if you want to see how far this goes back, just Google the 2008 Bucharest summit. That's whenever that was kind of the big point where NATO and George Bush said that yeah, we would like Ukraine to join NATO, and Putin physically turned up at the summit and he said no, we will not tolerate Ukrainian membership of NATO. So the Russian, the idea that this is madman Putin has just acted irrationally and this has all just suddenly come out of the blue, or it's just from 2014. No, this has been here for decades, and specifically in regards to Ukraine, it's really been heating up since 2008 in the Bucharest summit. That's whenever Putin specifically told NATO, we do not want Ukraine as part of NATO. We have legitimate security concerns, and those will be violated if you try to bring Ukraine into NATO. People talking between each other. Someone's posted a video link. I can't really watch that while I'm doing a live stream. It just wouldn't be fair on chat. It wouldn't be good etiquette. Apologies for that. Honestly, if we're staring down the barrel of nuclear apocalypse, both Russia and Ukraine, they can fight it out as they please. I mean, ultimately, that's the assessment that I feel that NATO and Western governments have had: is this war will happen in Ukraine and it will be contained to Ukraine. And the Ukrainians keep trying to push diplomatically and through statements for a no-fly zone because it's in Ukraine's interests, because Ukraine cannot win the war on its own, or it's very unlikely that Ukraine can win this war on its own. So it's in Ukraine's interest to try and expand the conflict. So I mean, yeah. But on the flip side, is NATO very strongly keeps telling Ukraine that no, unfortunately, we will arm you, but we are not going to fight this war for you. What Russian equipment has performed really well during the conflict? Well, essentially all of it, if it's used by competent crews and employed by effective commanders. Like I say, the T-72s, most of the T-72s that the Russians have used they're modernized to a fairly decent level. They're fairly capable tanks. In the south, they've been used effectively, where they're used in the north with competent commanders and proper tactics and doctrines are employed. They are effective. The problem is like I say, is they just haven't weaponry and equipment is only as good as the men put in to use it, to crew it and to fight with it. And on top of that, those men are only as good as the men who lead them. So I mean, like I say, a lot of the equipment is genuinely better than the Ukrainian equipment. It's just it's not being competently used or effectively employed. But where it has been competently used and effectively employed, it has worked very well, from what I have seen anyway. On the flip side, the Ukrainians are using their drones to quite good effect. They're scoring off some very significant, like in the grand scheme of things, minor but still quite significant in terms of cost effectiveness strikes with the Bayraktar drones. And then I've seen evidence where the Russians are starting to achieve similar results with their drones as well. So more people speaking between chat. Let's have a look at the YouTube and see what's. Let's have a look here. Really need to work out how to keep track of all these questions and stuff over time. So where am I here? Which dystopia would you rather live in, Demolition Man or Mad Max? I mean, I did watch Demolition Man, but it was like over 15 years ago, so I can't really remember more of it. I mean, Mad Max, I'm not exactly like a humongous, so I don't know, probably Demolition Man, because I don't want to be like killed or raped or something like Mad Max or something like that, or die of thirst or become a war boy or something like that. I think a more honest assessment is that I've read that it is wise for Gonzalo. Is it wise for Gonzalo to speak against the Ukrainians and spreading Russian propaganda? I mean, I've spoken about this a couple of times. From what I've seen of Gonzalo, it's not that what he's saying. Everyone has a right to speech, but at the same time, you are in a war zone. You are currently in a country that is finding itself at war. You're a guest in that country. You're not a citizen of that country, so in some ways, that's even worse. You're a guest in this country, and you're very openly saying things, whether you perceive it or not, to be very pro the side of the country that is invading the country in which you are in. So do not be surprised whenever the people around you in that country, especially as you're in a city that is under daily shelling and air attack from that invader, do not be surprised whenever the locals around you and the local military units or militia or whatever around you are going to have a very, very dim view and not take kindly to that. That's my assessment. It's just there's a time and a place in the middle of a war. Probably not the best place to plant the flag of free speech on the hill to die for, especially in the middle of a city that's effectively in the middle of a battle. That's kind of my point. Like if he went to Poland or Belarus or Russia or wherever coach would feel more at home at, if he left the combat zone, if he left Ukraine, yeah, it wouldn't really be a problem. I mean, I would still have critiques probably for what he's saying, but the point is those would be critiques. My criticism of him is it's like you're hiding in a closet, kind of like Anne Frank hiding from a Ukrainian death squad. Maybe assess why that is. Maybe leave Ukraine. That's kind of my take on Gonzalo. Michael, you need to get on the podcast of the. I haven't. I only watched 2 minutes of one of their videos and I wasn't impressed. But I personally have history with Carl, and I wouldn't expect that I would be welcome on that podcast, especially with some of the stuff he has. Oh, and YouTube just skipped out. Where was that? Apologies, I just YouTube keeps jumping up and down on the. I'm gonna have to find out a way. I'll have to ask Felix how he keeps track of chats and stuff. But Michael, do you? Oh wait. Have Russia got a defense in blue-haired roasty battalions that's making its way to Ukraine? Yeah, probably a bullet to the back of the head, to be honest. I don't think any of the blue hairs will actually ever end up in Ukraine, to be honest. It's one thing to virtue signal on Twitter. It's another to actually turn up in a foreign country in the midst of a war. And as you can see, some of the veterans themselves who did that found it out to their cost, and they've scuttled from Ukraine as a result. Get some of these dissolvable vitamin C tablets. Yeah, that's actually. I think I might have some of those. Though I do have multivitamins. It's people who might get the reference. I have Zanny berries here. I've got my own thing of Zanny berries. But no, I do take multivitamins, so I don't wither and die on the computer chair while looking at horrific atrocities in Ukraine. Michael, do you know where in the country the Ukrainian army is distributed? E.g., I would say the bulk of it. Well, probably not the bulk anymore, but you'll have a significant amount of it. I couldn't give you percentage-wise, but it's largely spread out across the east. But you'll definitely have a significant bulk of it in the Donbass, just because that is where a war has been going on for 8 years. So I'm skeptical of the claim, but the Russians say that the Ukrainians were building up equipment to invade the rebel-held areas. I'm skeptical of that claim personally, because I don't see why Ukraine would start a war it could never win. But either way, war there for 8 years, so there is always going to be a substantial amount of Ukrainian equipment in the Donbass. So I think that's why the Russians were looking to encircle the Ukrainian military units there. They're very heavily engaged, the Ukrainian units, so that's probably why they haven't been able to fully retreat from the developing encirclement there. But that's, if the Russians are able to seal that off, yeah, that would, in my estimation, break the back of the Ukrainian army east of the Dnieper. Then you'll have Ukrainian forces seem to be scattered throughout all across eastern Ukraine. It's hard to get an assessment. Because the other aspect is the sudden arrival of the territorial defense militias. So, it's one thing asking what's the state of the Ukrainian standing army. Why it's becoming a bit hard to distinguish between what action is being done by Ukrainian regular soldiers and what's being done by the territorial defense militias. But the Ukrainian army, I'd say, biggest concentrations of forces would be Kiev, Donbass, Nikolaev, and Odessa. Odessa. To a degree, Kharkov as well. And then you'll have smaller groups that are encircled in Sumy and Chernigov, or
scattered across the east. Let's have a look. What else have we got? Lunacy, I've tried to cover this for, but it certainly won't be their strong. Well, like I say, I only made it 2 minutes through one of their videos, and I just had to turn it off because it was just, oh, I just couldn't listen to it. Is the Foreign Legion a trap? It depends what you define as a trap. I do think that there will be a lot of Westerners who have probably joined it expecting one thing and then discovered that they've signed on for something very different and that has obligated them to something that they weren't expecting. Will anything come from Iran's latest actions? I honestly couldn't say. Well, the United States doesn't seem to have retaliated, but then again, the Iranian missiles didn't seem to actually hit any of the American targets. That could have been by design, though. But I don't know. I haven't been looking at the Middle East close enough in recent months to give an assessment. It's probably just another episode in this sort of proxy war that's fought in Iraq and this wider Cold War between Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, and then the United States is kind of caught in the middle of it to a degree. Or it's nice of you to be available at 6 a.m. for I was not available, and I was not happy. I'm sorry to say. Everybody just tired of the US being the world policeman. Yeah, to a degree. Like I say, the arrogance which the United States has conducted itself post 1991 is probably long since worn itself thin. Thoughts on Zelensky Drag Act video? I've only sparingly seen it. I've not watched it. I was actually back in December planning to watch Servant of the People. I think it's on Netflix, and I think it had English dubs, and I was planning to watch that, but I never got round to it. So I don't know too much about Zelensky. I'm not an expert on Ukrainian domestic politics, I'm afraid. Michael, is there any way we can clone Jonathan Bowden to fix any? I wouldn't know. Get Patreon or something for money subscribes. I have tentatively set up a coffee account, and I could potentially put out my PayPal account, but I'm in two minds about it. I don't feel overly comfortable with sourcing money from this, but at the same time, if this is going to be sustainable, I am going to have to try and monetize it to some degree. So I have set up a provisional coffee account, and I do have a PayPal. I'm just, I don't know. I'll have to see how I feel about it. There was part of the video where Coach went to take a piss straight. Like what? Could you hear it on stream, or did he? Because I mean, I can understand if a person needs to go to the toilet, because Felix goes to the toilet all the time, and we just fill in for him. But I mean, like, you didn't. I mean, I don't mind that, but it wasn't like an awkward silence, or you heard him or something, or what? What good would it be bringing back Bowden if 90% of people haven't heard of him? Yeah. I mean, personally, I'd rather bring back Powell, but I don't know too much about Bowden. So you're saying the poorest country in Europe has such a modern society that requires 26 medical lab based. I mean, Ukraine isn't the poorest country in Europe, not by a long shot. Moldova, I think, is, or Macedonia, or Montenegro. And yeah, Ukraine might be relatively poor compared to the West, but it is a large country, and it is still a fairly large economy, and it does have that Soviet legacy. You know, you're not talking like Bosnia or even Moldova or something. Like, you're talking of a country of 45 million people in Europe with a Soviet legacy. Yeah, it can be relatively poor, but I mean, it's not like a third world country. Its Soviet legacy has bequeathed to it a, you know, why is Antonov based in Ukraine? Because of the Soviet legacy. Why does Ukraine have, well, until recently, had a very surprisingly large defense industry because of the Soviet industry? Why is Ukraine have one of the world's largest truck manufacturers in Kraz? Because of the Soviet legacy. So it also has this Soviet legacy in terms of its medical
industry and stuff. So I mean, I'm not too sure what your conception of Ukraine was. Like, this isn't a country where like there's widespread poverty or something like that. Yeah, people can be relatively poor there, but it's not third world tier. It is a reasonably developed nation. We live in exciting times. We've faced destruction or rejuvenation. Going to be painful, whatever it is. Could Zelensky sign the treat lengthily to pairs? I assume you mean Paris. I mean, I guess he could, but I looking at the way he's conducted himself, I mean, unless you believe he's gone to Poland, I'm in two minds about that. But the way he's conducted himself has been, I mean, could you reasonably now, if you can remove your own political biases from this, could you honestly picture Biden, Boris, the new German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz? Could you picture Macron if they were put in a similar position as Zelensky is? Do you reckon they would have had been able to equip themselves and handle themselves and conduct themselves to any degree that that man has through the past 3 weeks? Like, I'm sure he is a coke addict and all this kind of stuff because I mean he is a comedian and an actor and stuff. But I mean, hypothetically, if let's just say he hasn't left Ukraine, could you honestly picture any Western leaders not doing that? I mean, I couldn't. I'm quite from what I've not been following him in and out, but I mean, I do have respect for the man for from what I've seen of him. I'm pretty sure if I dug down into his politics, I'd probably disagree with most of his politics. But just the way he's conducted himself, I've been rather surprised and have an element of respect for him. My prediction is it's going to get really bad. You could hear, oh god, you could actually hear him on the toilet. Oh no. Yikes. That okay, I don't think I'm going to watch that. So he was eating on stream and he went to the toilet. Oh no. That would have, oh, just the thought of it is making me, oh god. Have you done any streams with people before, Felix? I mean, I did a couple like 4 or 5 years ago, but they were very small. I recognize your voice from a while back. I wouldn't know. I mean, I've been on. I don't want to dox myself, but I have been on TV in the UK. Not like a TV show, but I have done interviews here and there on the UK in the UK. So I don't know if you're based in the UK, if you might have heard that. I don't know. But I mean, I personally don't like my accent, but I mean, I get confused for people and I get confused for being American or Canadian or Scottish or Newfoundlander, which is one of the more specific ones all the time. So I don't know, maybe it's just that. But generally, I've only really done streams with Felix. I mean, me and Felix did a couple streams on D Live last year or so. So maybe you might have watched one of those. Your information on Ukraine is incorrect. They are the poorest nation by GDP in 2021, and there's a population has lost 10. This was before the invasion. I mean, what do you mean by the poorest nation by GDP? What, per capita or what? But either way, like the point I'm trying to make is like Ukraine does have infrastructure. It's not a third world nation. You know, it's yeah, there'll be poverty and well, there'll be relative poverty there, and there'll be a lot of poor people. But I mean, it's it's not like an African country. It does have a legacy from the USSR, and these things will have been built and continued after the collapse of the USSR into independence. So that's all the YouTube comments so far. Let's snip back to the Telegram. And oh, why does it keep doing this? Telegram keeps sending me to the generic chat. Okay. Don't underestimate propaganda win for the West. We've ruined our economy since 2008, but sped that up with lockdowns, corona panic, convenient war, just really fit to draw attention right now. I mean, I'm skeptical of this idea that, I mean, what's the logic here that Russia invaded Ukraine to take everyone's eyes off Corona? I mean, you're gonna have to explain that a bit more to me. It's not quite following the reasoning there. Look, people talking between each other. Siege warfare in large European cities is not like doing it in Syria. I think it won't go well for Russia. It will alienate everyone, even the Russian. Yeah, I mean, yeah, yeah, I agree with that to a large extent. But the problem is where else in a war like this has there been modern urban warfare in sieges like this apart from Syria? Like, I mean, this kind of goes into why the Russians kind of fumbled at the start of the invasion, because no one's really done this before, in at least since like Korea. I know people keep bringing up the Iran-Iraq war, but the Iran-Iraq war is not really analogous to this in a number of respects. Like this is a new war that no one's really done since arguably since Korea. So it's a learning curve. People have to learn how to fight and how they're going to deal with this. So the Russians, because no one's really done siege warfare as such like this, apart from really in Syria, that's where the Russians are probably reading the script off, and then they'll tweak it and they'll amend it as it goes along. But that's where they've done it before. So then they'll translate that and tweak it when and as they can. But yeah, I mean, I don't think the Russians really want to be there for potentially years sieging cities in Ukraine, because it would just look very bad domestically in the ramifications of it. So I mean, I do agree with you largely to that extent as well. But President Clinton made a courtesy stop at Kiev on his way to Moscow for a trilateral statement signing. This is a quote from something. Not too sure if that's specifically addressed to me. War, sanctions, austerity measures, failure of US dollar, expedites world currency reset into cryptocurrencies. We can also take another example from Hong Kong to see how much paper shields are worth, in addition to paper shield. I'm not too sure what this is. Red pill dispensary, if this is directed at me or if you're having a conversation with someone else. As if the schematics for the T14 Armata aren't already leaked, or well, I don't know if they've not or what, but either way, it's just not a. Most nations won't put their most ultra modern equipment straight into battle straight away, because that's a good way that if it gets lost, to lose all the advantage that could come from it. If you're obsessing over it to the point of your health, where is it affecting your health? Maybe you should get some. I mean, just ultimately a sleeping pattern, really. And I didn't really have a social life before this to begin with, but yeah. Grift away, just don't advertise Raid Shadow. Oh, I know, it really annoys me whenever Marcus does that on all his videos. It's just, Marcus, I love you. You're great to do a show with, but we don't need Raid Shadow Legends in every bloody video that you come out with. But then again, if you're getting paid like 3,000, 4,000 pounds for it, I mean, yeah, I probably grift a Raid Shadow Legends advert for that kind of money. US was last bastion of individual rights against large organized monarchies. And it was a corporate favour. Many of our cities had little to no rights to the extent this is our future but worse. I mean, in the West, I think there's a trajectory. Yeah, the trajectory for the West is just a corporatized oligarchy, which is another point. I think I don't understand why the nomenclature for Russian billionaires is oligarchs, but we don't call American or Western billionaires, we don't call them oligarchs. Whenever in many ways, yeah, the overt political influence that Russian oligarchs have in politics is different to the way it is in the United States, but ultimately, in a number of ways, American billionaires probably exert more political influence in their system than Russian ones do. Because I mean, in the Russian system, ultimately the power is Putin. Is if Putin doesn't agree with it, he's kind of the dead stop on any ambitious Russian oligarch with political ambitions or something along those lines. In the United States, what you just get corporations and billionaires will just buy out half of Congress, and then their corruption is just hidden in layers of government contracts and in legislation. I wish the invasion didn't happen, but I want them to win. NATO have minced too many people in their stick. Don't worry, Americans have access, they just don't need to jump. Americans have guns for now. Well, I mean, you say that, but I mean, look at all the Americans who tried to defend their own property during the Black Lives Matter protests. They were either forced into a position where they felt they had to commit suicide, or they were arrested, and so I mean, it's very noble. And Ukraine to me explains why I personally would be in favor of civilian ownership of firearms, because they're there for defense against foreign and domestic threats, and just your own personal protection from the predations of criminals. But it's noble in its aspect in the United States. But I mean, if you, I guess you did kind of get a win with Kyle Rittenhouse, but I mean, if you're in the wrong state and you use your firearm to defend yourself, be it your person or your property, I mean, your life's destroyed. So, it's noble in goal, but the actual practice of it, it's being actively attacked and whittled down daily by lobby groups, by these billionaires we're talking about, and by politicians. Is opposition from civilians inside Russia going to affect the war? I mean, depends how long it goes, and it depends how tough the economic conditions in Russia get. But largely, the protests I have seen so far, it's mobilized the sort of, I don't know if liberal is the right word, but the political opposition, the sort of people who would look to Navalny and people like that. It's mobilized them onto the streets. But ultimately, political change in Russia comes whenever the babushka is on the streets and protest. That's whenever, if you start seeing loads of babushkas and old pensioners and Vatnik type peoples coming out and protesting, that's whenever I think Putin really needs to be very concerned. I think the biggest problem for Putin, I think, going forward is, I think the state is more, I think he's built up a state that can very easily overcome any oligarch instigated coups or opposition. But nonetheless, is the biggest domestic problem for Russia, for Putin politically, would be the oligarchs, because they're going to see a significant contraction to their wealth, to their assets abroad, to the isolation of themselves outside of their expensive lifestyles in Miami, London, Biarritz, and places like that. So they're going to exert a significant amount of pressure on Putin, and they could potentially, if that's not dealt with properly, as they could take that out from just influence behind the scenes in the halls of politics, in the Duma and in the Kremlin. Maybe they could start getting ideas of trying to mobilize some kind of movement on the streets, which would be a problem. Germany seems to have no willingness to restart their nuclear reactors. Yeah, I know. I think that's idiotic of the Germans, but because it's not just Greta Thunberg. There's always been a very strong green movement in Germany. It came about to oppose the stationing of American nuclear weapons in Germany, and then it's fed from nuclear weapons onto nuclear power. But the big reason was Fukushima. That's why the Germans closed down all their nuclear power plants. That's the main reason. It's not really Greta Thunberg, but yeah, it's come back to bite them. It's come back to bite all. I mean, I'm in favor of decarbonizing the energy and the economy as much as we feasibly can. I would consider myself quite a dark green environmentalist politically. If it's feasible to get to the stage where everyone drives electric cars and all electric generation is done via renewable clean energy, that's great. That's great for a number of reasons. It's good for the environmental reason, but it's also would speak dividends now because it means you're not dependent on energy supplies from the Middle East or from Russia, and it's not as subject to the fickle whims of geopolitical meddling and stuff. So that's one of the biggest reasons I'm kind of. I know this is probably. I know that statement has probably angered a lot of people in chat. Like, I'm not going to go off on a big tangent on it, but like, I'm in favor of green energy in the sense, like, I'm pro nuclear power. I think we should be building more sustainable nuclear power plants, and I think we should. I'm not in favor of wind turbines, but I do think there is a very good future for solar power and hydroelectricity and stuff like that. So I'm not like a green zealot. I do have nuanced opinions on my views on energy, on green energy in economics and stuff like that. But yeah, the biggest thing for me would be just the geostrategic security that comes with it, along with the environmental. We can negotiate with other countries and continents and soften our economic way better than the Russian. Too sure the specific context of that comment. I think it might be referring to someone else. Liberation Army, yeah. Well, the Chinese military, for people who don't know, it is called the People's Liberation Army, and then it's broken up into the People's Liberation Air Force, the People's Liberation Ground Forces, Police Force, Navy, and stuff. So there isn't as such a Chinese Air Force or a Chinese Navy. They're seconded to the wider People's Liberation Army, unlike in the West, where we have like the British Army, the Royal Air Force, the Royal Navy, and then in America you have the United States Army, Air Force, and such. So that's where Liberation Army comes from. Can you talk about Nazism in Ukraine? I can. This would be like the fifth time I'd be speaking about it. I've spoken about it. I think I've spoken about it in a previous stream that's already up on the channel and in the Telegram. It just it just really wears me out to keep repeating the same things. But for those who don't know, just a quick overview. And this was my big problem with the Lotus Eaters podcast, was they don't understand the connotations of what Nazi means in Ukraine and in Russia and in the former USSR. They and Westerners in that podcast, they come to Ukraine, they look at Ukrainians wearing SS death's heads and Sonnenrads, and they go, "Oh, Nazis, my grandfather fought against the Nazis to stop events in the 1940s," and yeah, but they don't view that like that in Russia and in the former USSR, because in Russia and the former USSR is, whenever you talk about the Nazis or you talk about World War II, is they don't immediately jump to what happened to the Jews in the events in the 1940s and regarding to them, because for numerous reasons, the Soviet Union and its inheritor Russia lost so many people during the Soviet Union to suddenly single out the Jews specifically as a special group didn't feel right. And the Soviet doctrine at the time was that the Jews, along with all the Soviet people, suffered equally from the predations of the fascists during the Great Patriotic War. And then the politics involving Stalin's initial support for Israel and then his rejection of Israel, well, that's all culminated over the decades across the Soviet period and into the modern era, where World War II and Nazism isn't perceived in Russia and in other parts of the former USSR is to do with, I don't know if I can even say it on YouTube. I've probably said far too much on YouTube. I never get monetized anyway, but the events that happened to the Jewish people during the 1940s, that's not what they think of whenever you speak of it in Russia. Is they think whenever you speak to a Russian about that, they immediately think, oh, well, my grandfather or my great grandfather died, or this entire section of the family died, or oh, the village I come from, half the village was killed in Belarus and stuff like this. So that's the connotations that it has in Russia. So whenever Russians talk about neo-Nazism, whenever they talk about their anti-fascist and anti-Nazi operation in Ukraine, what they view Nazi to mean is anti-Russian. Whenever they talk about Ukrainians being neo-Nazis, is they view these people, some of them are likely proper neo-Nazis and are properly anti-Semitic, of course, as there are people all across the world. But whenever the Russians talk about it, they're very specifically talking about, in that context, these are people who hate Russia and they hate Russians. That's the way you have to view it whenever it's said in this context, in the context of Ukraine. And then this is fed back, like I say, undoubtedly, and definitely within Azov and maybe Adir and other and the right sector and all these kind of, I don't even think the right sector exists anymore in my thinking of Svoboda. Well, either way, is there are definitely neo-Nazis and anti-Semites in Ukraine. And they definitely exert more political influence than they otherwise should. They have formed battalions and they do hold quite extreme protests, and they have disrupted the work of Parliament, but I don't think they are actually physically running the day-to-day government and policies of the government. But either way, these people do exist, and they do exist in number in Ukraine. But to add more nuance to this, because the Russians view Nazi as particularly an anti-Russian thing, that is why I expect, and this is just my conjecture on this, but this is why I expect we are seeing this plethora of Ukrainian soldiers wearing Sonnenrads, wearing death's heads and stuff like that, because they've appropriated this Nazi symbology, because they know it pisses off Russians, and they've appropriated it that for that reason. So, like I say, I'm hoping that's. Did this faction have an impact on the Maidan? Yes, this is kind of why these Azov and the quote unquote neo Nazis have this influence in Ukraine, because during the Euromaidan, they were the ones who were up the front. These were the ones who were attacking, in some cases killing the Berkut police officers. These were the ones who kind of were the muscle behind the Euromaidan revolution. And then after the revolution succeeded, they quickly formed themselves into makeshift militias to go off and fight the Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine. So that gave them a lot. That gave them a lot of influence in the post-revolutionary politics of Ukraine. At least that's from my understanding of it. Anyway, if I'm completely off kilter, if there's any Ukrainians or anyone in chat who thinks I'm completely off kilter, feel free to correct me, but that's my understanding of it. Okay, so pardon me, my throat is down again. I'm gonna have to drink some more of my Cancer Zero. Oh, pardon me. Do you see many of the civilians who have fled Ukraine ever wanting to repatriate? Probably, yeah, because the people leaving Ukraine are genuine refugees. If you look at the streams of people, apart from the trannies and the men who are escaping, if you look at the refugees crossing the Polish border, the vast majority of them they're women with children, or they're very elderly men, or they're very young men, people who aren't old enough. So these are genuine refugees. These are people with family back in Ukraine. So genuine refugees tend to want to. A lot of these people probably will end up staying in the countries where they end up taking asylum, but the vast majority of them will most likely return to Ukraine whenever it's feasible for them to do so. Because, like I say, genuine refugees tend to have a pining for their homeland, not like the quote unquote refugees that Europe took in post 2014, 2015. When are you allowing guests to speak? Yes, Christ, I'm coming up to, what was it, almost 3 hours. I will endeavor to make a stream where I'm not going to do it now because it's just going on too long. But I will try and set up some kind of streams where I can have discussions with people, but I'm probably only going to do that in Telegram because I'm not going to lie, I don't really trust many of you in chat to not say something that's going to get me in trouble on YouTube. Get a Brita water filter. Yes, I don't think it's a Brita one, but I do have a water filter. But it's just the water here just doesn't have a good taste. Caffeine dehydrates you. You need to send Michael a life straw. Okay, where are we going? No, I don't think I am going to drink out of the toilet. 5-stage water filter. This is so boring. I'm done. I'm sorry. It's boring. Who spoke out in chat? I can't remember the name specifically, but if Russia collapses in 6 months onwards, the game is up for them as attacked. If Russia collapses in 6 months onwards, the game's up for them as the carefully crafted liberation of Ukraine must be taken intact. BS. Vision in a few days as peacekeepers failed miserably. Sure, it's not particularly well worded, that I'm afraid, but I am going to wrap this up in about 30 minutes or so because I've gone on for a while and I still need to make myself dinner at some point, but try and skim through the rest of these. Why isn't the US giving MOABs to Ukraine? I mean, how would Ukraine deploy MOABs? They don't have air superiority, and any aircraft large enough to drop a MOAB would attract the attention of the Russians. And not only that, is where would they drop it? How would they drop it? I mean, anywhere where the Russians are is generally they're probably going to be surrounded by civilians, so why you call them man pads? Because, well, I mean, that's how they are called, aren't they? It is man pad. Man. Yeah, man portable air defense system, man pad. I mean, I know it sounds like some kind of tranny thing, but yeah, that's how it's called. Man pad aerial defense system. 1 trillion in Russian assets are frozen in Western banks. What are your thoughts on war damage? Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if Western governments started giving Russian assets to Ukraine. I can perfectly see that, how it's going to happen. And yeah, the spurgeries happening in this thread. Great. Oh. Okay, let's try and scroll down where there's actual questions, not people fighting each other. What do you think are the main tactical takeaways for the Russians and NATO? The Russian, yeah, after this war ends, in whatever way it does end, is you can expect massive reforms in the Russian army. They're going to very much need to completely reform how they structure their logistics and how they fight wars if they're going to fight wars like this in the future. Their command was not the best. They really need to get control of their OPSEC because the Americans have obviously quite deeply infiltrated Russian command and control their air force. The Russians, I think they need to figure out how they properly need to use their air force because it is quite noticeable how little it is doing on a day-to-day basis. Still don't know what happened with the drones, though the Russians are now using their drones. So I don't know why they didn't the first couple weeks, but I'm sure they could do some work there. So you'll probably see large reforms if the Russians are going to fight large-scale conventional wars like this. This is very much a wake-up call, and for them personally. So I think they are learning very valuable lessons, which they're applying in the field. But you'll see major reforms in the Russian military going forward, and I think NATO's takeaway from this is what a conventional war will likely look like. So who's doing well with what and where and how are they using it? Who's doing badly with what, where, and why are they doing badly? So the biggest takeaway from me, though it shouldn't really be this novel approach, would be that if the Russians are advancing armor screens through enemy territory, is probably deploy your infantry to secure the flanks of the road as the armor moves up, so they're not going to get ambushed close quarters by Ukrainians with anti-tank weapons. That the other thing that the Russians could do is probably deploy their drones a lot more, their recon drones, just ahead of their advanced columns, so they have an idea of what they're advancing into. I've seen this happen a couple of times, so they are conscious of it and they are improving it. But whenever a column advances, have a air defense network set up to cover the column 10 miles down the road or so. Once the column gets down there, set up another air defense network up near the front of the column, and then just have that sort of leapfrog of the air defense network, so you don't have Ukrainian drones, Bayraktars striking your logistics or soft skin vehicles or your anti-air defenses. But like I say, the Russians do seem to be doing that in places now. So Russia didn't try to keep civvy deaths to a minimum. They'd have won by now, potentially, but it would have been pretty horrific. You may find Entropy chat platform useful. Again, the problem with that is I'm like, if a person wants to donate money to me, yeah, I've set up a coffee, so yeah, I'll take donations and stuff. But I just don't like the idea, like, if a person wants to ask a question, like, I don't want to really go down the super chat angles because, one, I don't want to give YouTube money, and Entropy, like, I like answering questions, and I'd like to answer as many people's questions as I can. I don't want people to feel obligated to give me money to ask a question. Let's have a look. How likely are we to see a renewed Russian offensive on besieged cities? I mean, I would expect that. I would expect that the reason the advances have slowed is because the Russians are trying to work out the logistics. So once they've gotten their logistic lines and supply all sorted out, is you'll probably see a resumption of Russian offensives. But like I say, it's mud season, so it'll probably be offensives in areas, against areas where they can make gains. So we're probably not going to see massive advances like we have so far. It's probably going to be, okay, we supplied the army units around Kharkov. Let's do localized advances to completely encircle the city. Okay, we've supplied the troops around Mariupol well enough. Is it worth going into the city and taking it now? That's probably what we'll see. Or we've supplied the troops to the east of Kiev. They've got their supply issues are worked out. Okay, let's advance to the south and the east of Kiev and try and encircle the city there. That's probably what we'll see. I think the era, the stage of massive 40-mile long armor columns, I think that's probably past its point in this war. So, still impressive that Kharkov isn't. I know it's. I can remember in the first day is the assumption, and I think the Russians themselves said they had taken the city within the first few hours, but obviously that didn't prove to be true. If Ukraine wins, will Fur Force 4 increase? Yeah, probably. That'll probably increase no matter what way it happens. Michael, do you think Biden will do anything right? One thing, if not, why not? Do anything. I mean, I'm not really following what the Americans are doing. I only follow it occasionally whenever there's like a big announcement. So I'm not following what Washington's doing day in and day out. But I mean, I guess the right thing that he's doing is constantly telling Zelensky that they are not getting involved in a no-fly zone. That would be something that's probably right. I guess the Polish jets things, depending on where you stand on the side of the conflict, that could be either right or wrong. But yeah, but ultimately, I think Biden's just largely incompetent on foreign policy, so I don't really think he's. Yeah, Michael, you should at least split the difference as far as grifting, make an option for people. Well, like I say, like if people really are minded, I'll post. I don't know if people would prefer coffee or if they'd prefer PayPal, but for those who are really insistent about it, and I'm not going to be shilling this, but there's a coffee account in the Telegram for people who really are insistent about it, and I do appreciate it. But like I say, it just doesn't sit right with me to really be profiting off the stuff I talk about, but I'll leave it at that. So, right, let's try and work for these Telegram questions so I can hopefully get something to eat. Right, where are we? Again, guys, if you could just try and keep all the questions in that specific thread on Telegram, and then once I'm done for that, I'll have a look through the YouTube again just to finish it off. But it just helps me keep track of questions, not having to jump through. Any more comments on foreign fighters and the reasons they left, Ammo? I mean, again, I apart from what they've said themselves, is I think the Russians made a very clear note and a very clear example of how they plan to treat
foreign volunteers in Ukraine by striking that base, and it shook a lot of the foreign volunteers that they felt compelled to leave because of it, and also a lot of them have signed up to something that they weren't really aware of what they were getting into and the type of war that they were volunteering to fight in. That would be my comment on that. What's your thoughts on Syrians and Chechen fighters being brought in? Again, Syrians, lots of experience in lots of experience in urban warfare. Chechens, from what I've seen, most of the Chechens outside of the actual Russian regular army, they seem to be used in internal troop capacities, as in they're pacifying the country, they're keeping stopping any trouble coming up from the civilian population in the villages and stuff. And also in regards to the Syrians, it allows Russia to put out the save face, in the sense that Russia isn't the only one fighting. Russia isn't isolated. Syria is fighting with us in Ukraine. So that's the aspect there. So let's have a look. Let's go back to the other Telegram thread. Let's try and bang for these questions. No. Where is it? Where are we? 300. Fuck off. Why do you think Ukraine isn't surrendering, and why do these negotiations? Because I think the will of the Ukrainian government, and then to a degree the will of the Ukrainian people, just refuse to surrender to a Russian invasion at this point anyway. I think the will to resist just outweighs the cost of resisting at this point. Plus, like I say, it's very hard for me to conceptualize a Ukrainian victory. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I mean, what the Ukrainian government could just be minded to do is, okay, if we're going to lose this war, is we are going to make sure that it hurts as much as possible for Russia. That could be another aspect of it. But you know, who knows what's going on in the minds of the people in Kiev or in Moscow or anywhere for that aspect. Let's have a look. Questions between Ukrainian infrastructure is utterly terrible. I live in Bulgaria, know a number of Ukrainian the worst roads there. Yeah, I know, but I mean, Soviet roads are notorious for being Soviet roads. I mean, if you come to the UK and you look at the way that local councils pave the roads in the UK, it is diabolical. The potholes that you can get in the UK and the state of some of the roads in the UK. But that, just because that situation, that doesn't mean that the UK doesn't have a developed industry in medicine or whatever. I mean, it's kind of cherry picking that to a degree, from my assessment of it. So to Michael, yes, the earlier paper shield comment was a response to another. Oh, okay, not a problem. Okay, thank you for clarifying that to me. Can Russia nuke the chat? Inshallah, God willing. Problem with green energy is it's intermittent without good cheap batteries. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's the biggest problem with a green economy is the batteries need to become more efficient. There's only one good argument against nuclear power, and that one it seems to take. We don't have an endless supply of nuclear fuel. Well, yeah, but I mean, we still have hundreds of years at least of nuclear fuel, and so. I mean, I think the idea there is if we can stagger the nuclear energy from the transition from fossil fuels to nuclear energy, and then if fusion power is technically feasible, then the idea is hopefully we would invent and master fusion energy. We were self-sufficient in oil. The oil near the Falklands doesn't help us that nuclear stations like Hinkley Point were being built by. Yeah, I mean, I could speak for many times, for hours, about the failures of the British government in many respects. But definitely, I mean, yeah, don't build nuclear power plants. Increase the cost of fuel. It's, yeah, I mean, what more can be said about British energy policy? I mean, if I had my way, I'd probably buy myself probably a small wind turbine in solar energy, because good God, the energy that
costs here is diabolical, and it's only going to get worse as the days and months go ahead. I really hope Musk becomes Iron Man. We don't deserve. Okay, what's actually speaking to me here? Would have thought they'd know how to have infantry screen. Yeah, I would have thought as well, but apparently not. It's again, I don't know if it's just failure on the local Russian battalion commanders or if they just expected like we're going to advance as fast and as quickly as possible, so don't dismount the infantry or whatever. But it is a very noticeable thing that there was good drone footage put out by the Azov battalion of the engagement to the east of Kiev with an ambush within 20 meters. It looked like a Ukrainian anti-tank scored a direct hit on a Russian tank, and you just seen all the BTRs and the BMPs behind the tank rolling up behind it. Second the tank was hit, the infantry jumped off, and it's like, well, it's a bit late then. Why wasn't? I mean, the tank in this scenario, the video's somewhere in the channel somewhere, but you could see the armor column coming out of a field. Okay, an open field, you can sort of understand what's in the field. So you won't need really an infantry screen in the field, but they're coming into a village and a town. So why wouldn't you dismount the infantry as you come into the town to secure the buildings on either side of the road? But no, is in this drone footage you just seen this long column of tanks, BTRs, and BMPs, and the second the T-72 got hit and killed, the crew definitely died in it. That's whenever you see all the infantry dismount from the BMPs and the BTRs behind the tank, and it's like it's a bit late then. Why didn't the local commander? I don't know. Like I say, it's one of these mysteries. I'd like to hear from the Russians themselves at some point what their assessment of why they're doing it is. Would one attack in mud season hold the good stuff like drones back? You're gonna have to quantify what you mean by one good attack. One attack in mud season. If he was taking other places later in better weather, I'm not too sure what that means. So I am gonna have to try and whistle through these questions, guys. So I will do another stream at some point. I would just ask that you might not post any further questions at the moment. Just allow me to finish up the stream, and I'll depending if I do one with Felix tomorrow or not, I'll do another stream tomorrow. Roads are a joke in many Western countries. Barely anything goes. Yeah. How many people do you think Russia wants to execute? I mean, it's a bit of a broad question, and I mean, technically, Russia doesn't. It's illegal to execute people in Russia. They abolished the death penalty. In practice, is another thing, but I mean, that would need a bit more quantifying to me. Sadly, wind, solar are expensive. That you can only recoup the investment. Yeah, but ultimately, my ultimate ideal would be like my personal ideal would be to live as self-sufficiently as possible, have my own energy, potentially grow a degree of my own food, especially with the way the world's going. But does Michael speak Russian? No, I only know a few terms here and there. I do not. It's one of the I did learn it for a bit, but I never really kept up the course. I know terms and stuff here and there, but I'm recognizing how to spell certain words, and I'm understanding some bits of what comes out in various videos that come out of Ukraine. But no, I wouldn't say I speak Russian. No. If the West wanted Ukraine and NATO as Putin, why didn't they make it a member earlier? Again, because it's just not feasible for Ukraine to be a member. Is Ukraine NATO requires like different steps a country has to go through to get to membership. Like there's various reforms and improvements in various ways that a country has to go through in order to qualify for full membership of NATO. So I believe Ukraine was it on the membership action plan? It was on that path to do that, but either way, it just wasn't feasible. I don't know why NATO decided to tell Ukraine this, but Ukraine was never a feasible member, no matter what the Ukrainians were told by NATO, with the issue around Crimea and Donbass, because if I'm not mistaken, and I really should know this, I'll have to look it up, but if I'm not mistaken, similar to the EU, is each new addition to NATO needs to be verified and confirmed by each and every other NATO member. And it would be a really, it would be a very hard sell to get many countries in Europe to. Why am I suddenly getting loads of emails from? It'd be a very hard. I hope that hasn't shown up on stream, has it? Yes, it has. Ah. Yeah, please don't do anything with my email there, please. But it'll be a very hard sell to get a lot of NATO countries in Europe to agree to admit a member that is currently in conflict with Russia, especially Western European countries, because Western European countries just don't have the stomach for war, let alone the kind of war. So why is there the war then? Because my assessment is that Moscow seemed to fear. You don't know why NATO told Ukraine they could be. Wait, what? I mean, you're gonna have to quantify that. But no, the war is because Moscow was becoming increasingly concerned that NATO was going to admit Ukraine despite these substantial deficiencies that kind of barred. Because obviously Moscow doesn't trust NATO. NATO doesn't trust Moscow, so why would Moscow trust an alliance that has consistently for decades broken perceived to have broken pretty much every agreement that it's made with the Russians in regards to NATO expansion? So, I mean, it's the Russians were feeling themselves being backed into a corner, and then not only that is the lingering issues around the Donbass area. That's also played into it. I'm pretty sure Afghanistan and the apparent weakness of the United States under Biden, that's encouraged the Russians, because the Russians were, I'd say, rightly assumed that the United States doesn't have the stomach to really put its military power in. Well, obviously it never was, because Russia is a nuclear power and we can't really tolerate two nuclear powers going to war with each other. But yeah, I'm starting to ramble a bit and lose my train of thought, but the Russians ultimately felt that they were being backed into a corner in regards to Ukraine, and Moscow felt compelled to act, and that's why the war has come about. Sorry if that was kind of a bit rambly at the end, but that is all the Telegram questions, so I apologize if anyone posts any more questions in Telegram. God. Perhaps Ukraine with NATO support would be too significant of an enemy to take on protracted. Yeah, ultimately it was diminishing returns, as it were, as the time frame for Russia to intervene militarily in Ukraine was diminishing, because the Ukrainian army was building up its strength. It was becoming more professional. So it was just a zero-sum game. Look, either we go in now while we still can reasonably do something, or the opportunity is going to be lost to us. Because if I'm going to be honest, in hindsight, Putin in Moscow is probably wishing that they just enacted a full invasion in 2014 after the ousting of Yanukovych. That would have been the best time for the Russians to have gone in hindsight, because then the Ukrainian army was just nowhere near what it was today. It was all old Soviet outdated stuff. The troops were poorly trained, poorly motivated. Genuinely, in 2014, half the country probably would have welcomed in the Russians as liberators in 2014. So yeah, it's not just the expansion that makes NATO untrustworthy, but they claim defensive alliance when I mean, that would be the other aspect of it, because obviously I don't think you can really understand why I don't think you can understand the Russian policy and actions in Ukraine without understanding Kosovo and NATO's campaigns in the former Yugoslavia. So, LOL getting here right when Michael gets tired of I'm sorry. I'm sorry, but this has gone on for about 3 hours now, and I've not eaten today, and I apologize for that. But like I say, if what am I forwarding? Oh, never mind. So I'm going to go to the YouTube. I'll go through the questions in the YouTube now. So I'm sorry to anyone in Telegram, but I really need to start to wrap this up. So let's have a look at YouTube. Where are we on YouTube comments? Please don't be a lot of questions in YouTube. I hope just in 100 years' time, our people will have some semblance of autonomy. I think this is around about where I was. A lot of deleted questions, though. I'm not too sure if that's YouTube deleting them or if people are deleting them then. Yeah, so hereabouts was I? Mosley or Powell? Powell. Yeah, I'm not some cringe Mosley. I'm definitely Enoch Powell was a great man who was still even to this day criminally underlooked how visionary he was, and not just on the thing he is most remembered for. Powell was far ahead of his time in many respects. So I'm very much more Powell than I am. Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm Mosley at all, to be honest. So he was eating stuff for like half an hour. Good God, Coach Foodie Pill. Why do you think Farage backed off when he was at the peak of his power after Brexit? I genuinely think that, well, this is getting a bit off topic, but I genuinely, because I was sort of, I wasn't part of UKIP, but I was friends with people close to Nigel, and I'm friendly with people who are still close to Nigel. Is that at that time, Nigel was genuinely just tired of politics. He wanted to go off, make his money on Fox News, and in essentially retire from politics. So that, Michael, what do you think of the Russian sanctions of the Americans today? I don't know what they entail, but I mean, ultimately they're probably moot because the Americans sanctioned them first. And yeah, do you do neck training with your weights? No, I've only got a pair of dumbbells, but I need to get back into doing that. I do need to start lifting weights. Because Russian politicians came to wealth by means of privatization and literal banditism in the 1990s, yeah, I think that, yeah, it was one of the greatest tragedies of the collapse of the USSR was the rise of bandit capitalism across the republics. And I don't know why the Russians still have a warm view of Yeltsin, but I mean, Yeltsin to me is one of the greatest villains of Russian history with what he did, signing the Belovetsa Accords, which has led to, you know, arguably where we are today, and the economic system that he set up that hollowed out the much of the Soviet legacy that Russia was bequeathed. The Second Chechen War had similar effects to this, but in reverse here they are fighting the countryside. Well, the problem with Chechnya was it was the mountainside and it was Grozny. That's why the fighting there was brutal. Ukraine, it's largely flat land with some forests, but it's the cities that are the real problem for the Russians. If the Russians can get their act together, they'll dominate the countryside, because that's what all these tanks, all this equipment the Russians are rolling in. It's built for open country fighting. It's the cities that are, to a degree, the forests. But you know, if they properly deploy their infantry, it would negate that. In the event we go nuclear, what's the best country, in your opinion, in Europe to survive it? Probably somewhere in the Balkans, ironically. Ireland. It's not part of NATO, so I wouldn't expect it to get nuked. Maybe one of the Scandinavian countries if you live up north. I mean, nuclear winter isn't really going to affect you much up there. In the event, question: what have I got against Woes? I've got a lot against him. I'm not particularly going to dredge up stuff there, but just say if you go into his channel and you try to talk about me, your chats will be deleted and probably banned. Those groups are probably not even particularly anti-Semitic. They're just ultra-nationalist and anti. Yeah, if that's referencing the Azov and the Nazi stuff, yeah, that's the point I was trying to make. Okay, that's maybe the Azov Battalion are just edgy Gypsy Crusader fans. Save up a these. Back in 2015, a survey found that 33% were prepared to move for a better life. Do you think that number has gone up or down since it? Well, I would imagine it would have gone up. I mean, invasions kind of tend to do that. GDP doesn't account for distribution. I wasn't saying that, but GDP does account for something. It doesn't. It doesn't. It doesn't mean GDP. Aggregate GDP isn't the same as GDP per capita, but it is worth something. Like if a country has $1 trillion GDP, you can bet that it has some kind of infrastructure there to sustain that. I says having caffeine does not dehydrate, and I think that. Oh no, is this more questions? Oh no, a whole bunch more questions. Oh no, is it? Or is YouTube just screwed up on me? I'm like, oh no, it's just a few more questions. How could the Ukrainians improve their resistance? Oof. Go to ground. I would say that largely what they're doing at the moment. Trying to fight pitched battles is probably not going to turn out well for them, because that's the Russian army's kind of built to fight pitched battles, and they're doing well at that. So probably, it'll cost a lot of civilian lives, but yeah, just retreat into the cities and into the forests and fight like the partisans did in the Second World War. Take as many RPGs, javelins, NLAWs, manpads as you can, take them into the cities, draw the Russian tanks and forces into the cities and fight them there, so you negate their firepower and their innate advantages that they have in the open field. But I mean, the problem is that the Ukrainians don't really have a lot of room for maneuver. Zelensky will sacrifice if it means NATO are brought into the war. Active protection systems are very. Some of the Russian explosive reactive armor does seem to be working, but yeah, it does say that they really need to update their tank armor, especially. Who's winning, globalists or Bolsheviks? You're gonna have to quantify that a bit. End stream. Yes, I just a little bit longer. There's people who need to ask questions. You have a good YouTube voice, thank you. But anytime I've ever listened to myself on YouTube, I cringe very badly. Putin took the conservative talking points going forward with the. Oh, the stream just ended. Oh no. Okay, I see. Never mind. I'm just playing the footage from my previous stream. So there you go. This stream is officially longer than the one I did the other day. So that's really a sign I need to wrap this up. So final questions. Took the talking points, Eurasia, but Bolsheviks. Well, I mean, communists in Russia are quite socially conservative. I think that's something Westerners don't really seem to understand. Is that Eastern communists tended to be quite socially conservative. My country in South America is full of them, built for BWF, big white. Okay, and there we go. How? Final question. This final question: how is it the Chechens are fighting for Russia after 2 devastating wars? Simple. The Russians paid them off. The Russians gave them basically everything up to. Chechnya within Russia today is basically an almost de facto independent state. It doesn't have foreign affairs, and it doesn't have its own real military, although it has very substantial internal troops. But it's actually, you have to understand, is that Moscow pays Chechnya to be quiet and has given Chechnya massive autonomy within Chechnya. So that's pacified most of the Chechens. There's still a large number of Chechens who fought against Russia who now live abroad. They've formed their own battalion to fight the Russians in Ukraine. So there is a sort of quasi-Chechen civil war that's going on in Ukraine. And with that, I'm going to end the stream. Bit long. I really cannot keep doing these 3-hour streams, but there we go. I hope this was of use to some people to listen to my dulcet tones ramble on for 3 or 4 hours. I hope that was worth it. But either way, I need to go take a strepsil for my throat and eat something. So yeah, if Felix gets in touch with me, I'll look at doing a stream with him tomorrow. I'll hopefully try and have a guy from Tiraspol or Minsk on that stream. Failing that, I'll do my own independent stream and I'll see if I can get one of those guys onto it then. So, yep. Did you get that Chechen Kadyrov? No, Kadyrov hasn't yet. Kadyrov posted in my Telegram, but I live in hope. If I can get Kadyrov post in my channel, I would feel vindicated. Garlic, cheese, chips. No, I'm probably going to make myself sweet potato fries and cook my own steak. So I'm not going to get a takeout tonight. But with that, again, thank you very much, guys. I will go get something to eat. I'll come back, have a look at what's happening, post it up on the channel through the night, and then I will see you tomorrow in a stream or not. So thank you for coming along, and I'll speak to you then. And if anyone's given money into the coffee account, I appreciate it a lot. Thank you very much. I do. I'm not going to be shilling my PayPal and coffee and stuff on every stream or something like that, but it is there if people feel they want to give me something, and it is greatly appreciated. So with that, thank you very much. Now, how do I end the stream? So